Subscribe.
A Boy and His Blob is a game defined by its gimmick, a gimmick that I don't very much like. Everything else about it I find either okay or middling. The main gimmick of the game is that your blob friend does all the work for you. The only thing the player can do themselves is walk around and jump. Every other action has to be done with the aid of the blob. By throwing different colored jelly beans for the blob to eat, you can make it transform into different things, maybe a trampoline or a ladder or even a cannon. All this seems cool on paper, but in practice I find it rather annoying to deal with. What makes it difficult for me to really enjoy is that I don't actually control the blob. I can only tell it what to do and feed it multicolored beans. The fact that I can't directly control this character makes progression slow, and adds this really long delay between figuring out a problem in my head and actually being able to solve it. For example, if I see a section of the stage below me that I'd like to get to progress, I can't just simply drop through the platform by pressing down and jump. Instead, I have to pull up the menu, select the bean that lets me drop through platforms, throw the bean, watch the blob hop over to it and eat it, then transform into a hole that I can finally drop through. See how long-winded that example was? That's the sort of problem that permeates this entire game. Little things like going up or down or crossing gaps are all like that. Why can't I just pick the object I need straight from the menu, or just be able to drop through platforms on my own? It's not like the blob really adds anything either. There's no arc at the forefront of this adventure the boy and the blob go through. The game is mostly just level to level. I will admit there are some cool puzzles that take advantage of these mechanics, but the vast majority of the gameplay is much like the example I gave. Other than this gimmick, A Boy and His Blob doesn't really have anything to say. Even if my problems with it were addressed, I'd just be left with another 2D platformer. That's not to say the other stuff is bad. There's just not much this game has to say with its story or visuals or music or anything like that. It felt pretty run-of-the-mill in those areas. A Boy and His Blob only really has the whole blob idea going on, and since I don't really like that part of the game, I don't really like the game overall.
4 out of 10!
Among Us is another one of those cultural impact games. The way that this game and its imagery burst its way into our collective subconscious is wild to me. Every time I hear someone say any of the buzzwords like imposter, sus, or just Among Us, a neuron fires in my monkey brain. What's more wild is how recently it took over. Among Us came out in 2018, but it didn't find itself in the mainstream until 2020 when everyone was forced to stay home. Among Us was the perfect game for this world we now found ourselves in. It recreated a classic playground game, which made it really easy to understand. Then you add some tweaks to make the gameplay more interesting, take that game online, and it becomes the perfect fit to play with friends over quarantine. You've also got a really charming art style that puts a cartoony blanket over the deceit and murder that keeps these games feeling relatively light. The best part about Mafia, and by extension Among Us, is that it creates a great environment for conversation. Most of the actual gameplay in Among Us isn't that special. If you're a crewmate, you go around doing tasks hoping not to die. If you're an imposter, you go around killing trying not to get caught. The juicy stuff all happens in between rounds, when everyone needs to figure out who to eliminate. That's where you get all the excitement, all the yelling, gaslighting, etc. that makes the game memorable. The main problem with this is that Among Us itself isn't really an interesting game on its own. Rather, it's a vehicle for interesting interactions. It's fun to watch streamers play or play with your friends, but public lobbies aren't that fun because there's not as much interaction between players. And because of that, it's harder to find enjoyment out of the game compared to playing with friends. I still think even today Among Us can be fun. As of writing, I feel we're in a collective burnout with Among Us, but let us not forget how insane it can really be.
7 out of 10!
I'm not sure many people have heard of Awe. It's a game I got for cheap on Steam. I haven't seen any stuff online about it at all. I won't say that Awe deserves to be an internet viral hit, but it's a fine time nonetheless. Awe is a puzzle game. In each level, you're given a low poly planetoid, and your job is to terraform the planet by placing items on the tiles until you meet a quota. In order to get items, you need to match a certain pattern of tiles. For example, if you need to place a tree, you might need to click a yellow, blue, then yellow tile to obtain one. Different objects require different patterns, placing an object changes the color, and the planet is constantly rotating. That's the core idea. You can go through different planets that get progressively harder to complete, but in general, Awe is a pretty laid-back game. It's got simple visuals, an atmospheric soundtrack, and spacey sound effects. With a puzzle game as simple as this, it's really important that the main gameplay loop connects with you. In Awe's case, I was having fun, but as the puzzles got more complicated, I lost interest.
On the harder levels, you may only get a small chance to find a pattern you need, and then you have to wait until the planet turns back around. Not to mention, if you place an item in a certain place, you can screw up future patterns and have to start the whole thing over. Seems like a simple fix. Let the player control the camera and remove tiles if they want, but then awe might be too easy. This conflict puts my feelings on awe right in the middle somewhere. I like the idea of it, but the further you get, the more problems pop up with its design. The first section is nice, but I haven't ventured very far beyond that. But given the context I got this game in, it was a pleasant surprise.
6 out of 10!
The first and most obvious thing I can say about BattleBlock Theater is how it looks like a Newgrounds style game. It's got the art and some of the humor of that era, and I think it was one of the better ones to come out of that time in gaming. As it turns out, this game was made by the Behemoth, the same team that made Castle Crashers, which is one of the most defining games of the early indie days. It brings a certain energy to the game that's a little more down to earth and not as concerned with following tropes or traditional game design rules. That being said, I found the gameplay of BattleBlock Theater to be on the safer side. 2D platforming gameplay is fun, no doubt, but something about it makes the levels feel less interesting the longer you play. Maybe it's the fact that all the levels take place on the same stage-like setting, or that the layouts are all set up on a grid of blocks and switches like some Mario Maker type stage. Mechanically, all these levels are pretty fun, and that's all you can really ask for with something like this. BattleBlock isn't trying to blow your hat off, it just wants to have some fun. And yeah, BattleBlock Theater is fun, especially if you can play co-op. You get a consistent set of good stages, good controls, and some cosmetics to help you stand out. The story is fine, it doesn't demand that much attention, but I think that's good for this type of game. For stuff like this, it's all about presentation, which I think BattleBlock is good at. The cartoon visuals, the stage play / puppet show aesthetic, the nice soundtrack, all voiced by a pretty hilarious narrator. The humor in these types of games is probably what's going to age the worst, but luckily BattleBlock doesn't rely on it as much as some other games. It's mostly about the gameplay here, which was the right call. Not a real game changer, but surprisingly fun even today. Just try to bring a buddy along if you can.
7 out of 10!
I feel like kind of an asshole for writing a review on this game. Before Your Eyes isn't really meant to be broken down the way I do things. It's meant to be experienced, it's meant to be felt. The story had me from beginning to end. It hit nerves I forgot about, and eventually had me crying at the end. Since the story is the meat of the game, I won't spoil anything, but it definitely hit a chord with me. What makes Before Your Eyes unique is the way you interact with the story. The game is meant to be played with a webcam. With it on, the game will track your eyes and skip forward in the story every time you blink. It's an ingenious way to use the medium of video games. You'll want to stay and experience the entirety of the scenes, but at some point your body won't let you. At some point, you have to blink. It's a really great allegory for the human experience. The term blink and you'll miss it is embodied by this game, and it's exactly the type of unique and impactful use of video games I've been talking about. This is something movies, books, and music can't do, and it's awesome to see. Now, this is a review, and as shitty as it is to say, I do have one major problem with the game. If you don't have the perfect lighting situation, the blink detection on the webcam will not work. Unfortunately, when I played this game, my setup wasn't super conducive to outside light. That was intentional, because with any other game, it'd be annoying to have a glare on the screen or the sun shining in my eyes while I play, but it ended up biting me in the ass eventually. And without the mechanic, the magic of Before Your Eyes fades away. The story is still interesting, don't get me wrong, but that mechanic brings everything together. Without that, it feels like a sad point and click. So if you want to play this game, try to get a good webcam or set up in a place with decent lighting, and I assure you it'll be worth it. If you can't do that, it might still be worth playing, but you won't get the full experience, unfortunately.
9 out of 10!
I think Besiege is a cool game, I just don't really care enough to play through it all. It has a lot of depth to explore with its building mechanics, which the whole game is built around. You can make tons of different stuff as evidenced by the Steam Workshop, and I'm sure that by the end you'll have the knowledge to build cool stuff like that. My problem is that doing all that wasn't an investment I wanted to make. Right away the game gives you a lengthy tutorial explaining how the building system works. It's very long, yet it scratches only the surface. There's building blocks, wheels, weapons, pulleys, and more. All those things come along with their own buttons, and some have other stipulations that need to be met before they actually work. It was helpful to know where the game was going right away, but unfortunately it was not a direction I wanted to head. With games like these, it's mainly about the mechanics rather than the experience. I feel like in order to get my worth, I need to explore those mechanics, but the tutorial let me know right away that if I really wanted to explore everything, that would take a long time. I tried out some of the levels to at least give it a shot. I also downloaded some of the workshop creations, and really all it did was deepen my feelings towards it. it. I couldn't get very far in the single player trying to brute force it, and the workshop stuff I downloaded I didn't even know how to operate half the time. The barrier of entry was just too high for me this time. I understand that this game is pretty cool. It looks and sounds pretty cool, and there's a lot there for people to sink their teeth into, but my playstyle just did not mesh with this game. I've always got other things to play these days, things that may not be as deep but will tell a story or don't take much time to fully experience, or are easier to pick up for one reason or another. For that reason, even though I have played Besiege, beating it is always near the bottom of my list of priorities.
5 out of 10.
Half-Life is an all-time classic game. It marked a shift in first-person shooters towards a more narrative-focused experience, using the combat as a means to tell a compelling story rather than keep a high score. You had voice acting, NPCs, fully interactable story sequences, and more linear level design. All of these things have been done before, but not quite in this context. It was this, along with Valve's general prestige, that enticed me to play Half-Life. But to be honest, I wasn't that motivated to try it because I had heard of some of its flaws. There was some jank, along with a few unfinished segments, and generally the game didn't look to have aged that well. Then I hear about Black Mesa, a fan project aiming to remake Half-Life for the next generation, massively updating everything, the graphics, the game feel, and most importantly, finishing those segments that Valve had failed to. Black Mesa quickly became my preferred way of playing Half-Life, and boy am I glad I made that decision, because it was one of the best shooters I've ever played. It had the DNA of the original game, but it wasn't afraid to take liberties to modernize. It has to be said that for a game like Half-Life, the updated graphics really do up the atmosphere. There were a few times where I just had to stop and take in the set pieces. I watched a behind-the-scenes documentary on the project, and I really appreciated how they were willing and able to adjust the level design to streamline things. You can tell most of it is still Half-Life, but these devs knew every nook and cranny of this game and used that knowledge to the best of their ability. In the same vein, I was blown away by Zen. Seeing footage of the original Zen, it was clear that the final area of the game was just left unfinished. For what reason, I don't know, but the team for this game took that as an opportunity to flex their game dev skills. They took the most liberties with this part, and I think it paid off overall. The areas themselves are stunning. The maps are still linearly designed, but they did a decent job of disguising that fact from me while I was playing. Even though I was progressing in a line, I always felt like I was worming my way deeper into the unknown. This goes for the rest of the game as well, but I felt it most with Zen. I only have a few problems with Black Mesa when it comes down to it. The pacing in some areas felt all over the place. As cool as Zen was, it was the worst offender in this aspect. I distinctly remember an area that's largely puzzles and platforming, and then the next room is just a never-ending gauntlet of aliens to blast. It felt like the team were compensating for the previous segment, but in the end it just felt disjointed. Lastly, the ending of the game felt rather anticlimactic. The whole story of Black Mesa felt like it was building to something, but we never actually got there. Overall though, Black Mesa has stood against the others as one of the best games I've played. You all know I'm a sucker for atmosphere, and Black Mesa does that and so much more. It's one of those games that just sticks in my head to this day. For anyone looking to experience some classic games, Half-Life is a must, and Black Mesa is in my opinion the best way to experience it.
9 out of 10!
Castlevania, what happened to you? You used to be a critically acclaimed franchise, but you stumbled one too many times it seems. I like Castlevania, but the games weren't really mainstream by the time I was playing games. Instead, I grew up watching videos about the classic games on YouTube. Apparently they were quite the hit, offering a different spin on the 2D platformer on the NES. I'd give the first one a few tries over the years, but they were a bit too difficult for me. While I wasn't around for Castlevania's heyday, I was lucky enough to catch wind of Bloodstained, a spiritual revival as was popular at the time. The main project was Bloodstained Ritual of the Night, a successor to the Symphony of the Night style games, but the side project Curse of the Moon looked more interesting to me. Bloodstained Curse of the Moon was the classic Castlevania successor. It was a smaller game, but set out to emulate and modernize the classic Castlevania gameplay. The visuals and sound were very reminiscent of the NES games. If you thought this was a Mega Man 9 or 10 type situation, I wouldn't fault you one bit. The visual style is very similar, but Curse of the Moon is indeed all new. New characters and story set in a new place. It all feels Castlevania, but is different enough to be called its own. The soundtrack also follows classic Castlevania fare by being filled with great chiptune music. The gameplay of Curse of the Moon is also very Castlevania feeling, specifically Castlevania 3, as you're able to switch between party members on the fly to deal with various situations. It's a good feature to implement, as it allows for playstyles to shine and for extra strategizing, which is important during some boss fights. One thing I wish they hadn't kept from the old days was the physics. Stiff control is a trademark of classic Castlevania, except for 4, but the physics always felt wonky back then, and they do here. The hardest part for me to get over when I was playing was how the characters drop like a bag of bricks after running off a platform. In every other major platformer I've played, there's a sense of momentum, but in Curse of the Moon, the moment you step off, you fall straight down. My other problem with Curse of the Moon is that it's really short. I made it from beginning to end in just under 2 hours on my first playthrough. It's kind of disappointing because Curse of the Moon isn't offering much else in the way of depth. What the game does offer is decent, but the super short length left me with an empty feeling.
7 out of 10!
Just like the game itself, my experience with Borderlands 2 was pretty volatile overall. At points I was loving it, and at others it was a slug. The game exudes this wild energy, no doubt in large part by its art style. The art of Borderlands 2 has become pretty iconic these days. Not many other games choose to go for the rough cell shading and dark lines. If you ask me, this is the best part of the game, because most everything else is just quirky shooter. I guess it's not quite fair to levy that criticism on Borderlands 2. The cartoon aesthetic, wacky abilities, quirky shooter has become a bit of a trend these days, but Borderlands 2 was a standalone title at the time. It takes a lot of aspects from other games and mashes them into one, which ended up making its own identity. The vehicles make me think of Halo, the shooting makes me think of Call of Duty or TF2, and the loot system gives me shades of old dungeon crawlers. On the whole, I think this mashup works pretty well. You've got some cool classes and guns to work with. The world and story I didn't find as interesting, but since the shooting was fun enough, I didn't really care. The other best part of Borderlands 2 is definitely the co-op. If you have the chance, I highly recommend playing this way over anything else. With co-op, you get to work around each other's classes and weapons, and exploring becomes much more fun if it's a shared experience. I do think the game was meant to be played this way as well. While I got through most of the game with a co-op group, the final stretch I had to do by myself. And man, the enemies are all massive bullet sponges. Stuff like that is more tolerable when there's more people because you can continuously lay on the pressure, but alone it makes combat almost unbearable. Borderlands 2 ends up being quite the quirky shooter. And you may be tired of that trope these days, but this game was and still is one of the better ways to experience it. It's adrenaline pumping, it's visually distinct, its gameplay is well executed, it can get repetitive towards the end, and it's nowhere near as fun if you're playing alone, but if you do get the chance to play it as it's meant to be, it is a great time.
8 out of 10!
Castle Crasher seems like a game that you had to be there for. Like, in order to really get it, you had to play it around the time of its release. Unfortunately for me, that wasn't the case, and therefore Castle Crashers didn't really connect with me. It played fine, but the bit that I did play was full of that late 2000s, early 2010s Newgrounds humor. Not to rip on that entirely, if you like that style, then that's cool, but it wasn't enough to sell me on the game. Castle Crashers plays pretty fine. It took me a minute to get the controls, but at the end of the day, it is pretty similar to other beat-em-up games. I guess I just thought there would be more combos and stuff like that. I thought the combat was fine, if not a little clunky, thanks to the depth issue a lot of these games have. That usually wasn't a big deal because one of my friends was able to cover for me most of the time. I played co-op with 4 people and we tried the beginning of the game and just didn't really find it that engaging. It felt fine in action but didn't really do anything gameplay wise to really stand out. Most of the uniqueness of Castle Crashers comes from its aesthetics. It screams Newgrounds with its Adobe Flash-esque visuals and crude humor. If I were playing this game back in the day, I probably would have found it really funny, but I just felt too old, jaded, and a little out of touch to get this one. For the record, I do like the Flash art style. I was there for that era of the internet, and so there's a certain connection there, and there is something to be said for how down to earth it makes a game feel. But nowadays, if I want to play a beat 'em up, I've got other options. Ones that are more fleshed out, whose presentation appeals to me more, so this one will probably continue to sit unfinished for now.
5 out of 10.
I'm surprised it took me so long to play Celeste. I even had friends telling me it was right up my alley, but I ignored them for one reason or another. It just wasn't very high on my list of games to play. I knew it was good, I could be confident in that, but in a way it made it less of a priority. I like to gamble with games sometimes. If a game looks good, I might buy it, but I'd also rather buy something more out there. If I like it, then great. If I don't, then I learned something. Nowadays, I feel like I've figured out my palette more or less, so I don't do it as much anymore. Eventually, I did buckle down and buy the game,
game. I needed a game I could count on, and I'm glad I picked Celeste, because it was exactly that. It's one of those games that does a great job of blending its gameplay and narrative together. Climbing Celeste Mountain can be tough. It can be a test of your will, your patience, your anxiety, and more. The greatest part was seeing that come through in the characters. Madeline would put words to how I was feeling as a player, woven into the context of her world. This validated my own feelings and made me want to keep going, for the sake of both of us. To me, that's the magic of Celeste. The platforming challenges are decent in their own right, so is the music, but those parts aren't special on their own, even if they are well done. When I go back and listen to the soundtrack, I remember the areas they came from, the story beats they played alongside, same with the levels. All these things were designed in a way that came together to make something bigger than their parts. I'm really glad I finally got to sit down and play Celeste. It's another game that'll stick in my head for a while. It was doubly great as it explored themes of which I could see in my own life. It's a game about climbing a mountain with mid-air dashes and springs and ghosts and magic mirrors, and yet it felt grounded thanks to its approach to storytelling. The characters felt real, and that matters a lot. I should stop before I go off the rails praising this game, but I had a fantastic time with it, and I'd recommend it to practically anyone who knows how to hold a controller. If that's you, consider picking this game up.
Oh my god, it's a 10 out of 10!
Chiptune Champion was my solution to not having Guitar Hero back in the day. I enjoy rhythm games every now and then, but the classic series always eluded me. Then I spot Chiptune Champion on Steam. Given the name, this game obviously has more of a focus on chiptune music. It's not classic rock songs like in Guitar Hero, but don't let that lead you to ignore how many great songs are actually in here. The gameplay is straight to the point. Just time the buttons with the song and you've got it. It's simple, but always so satisfying to hit the notes perfectly and try to keep your combo up as long as possible. So much in fact that I would play the same song over and over to go for that perfect score. There's a lot of songs to choose from in the base game, most of which are pretty decent chiptune tracks. However, Chiptune Champion also gives the player the ability to create and download custom songs, and this is where I think the game really shines. The editor is a little much to comprehend at first, but it does give you all the tools you need to lay down a sequence to play with. Personally, I got more time out of downloading other tracks, usually classic video game songs. My main issue with Chiptune Champion is the controls. Now, I don't have a Guitar Hero guitar or anything like that. I just have my keyboard, and playing the game for long sessions on the keyboard is awful. You can map the buttons to whatever keys you like, but I just could not find a layout that didn't give me major hand cramps. I tried everything, including holding the keyboard like a makeshift guitar. With the accuracy and speed needed for some of these songs, I was really struggling at points, and it did eventually force me to quit entirely. If there's a better way to play it, I definitely recommend Chiptune Champion. It's got good songs, responsive buttons, and the custom stuff. If you're like me and only have a keyboard though, approach with caution. Stick with short sessions and maybe you'll be okay.
6 out of 10!
I grew up way past the heyday of the original Counter-Strike. I'm pretty sure the only reason I have it is because it came in a bundle. Needless to say, I don't have a lot of experience with Counter-Strike. I played a lot of CSGO, as I've said before, but anything before that is before my time. Counter-Strike was released in the early 3D days on PC, originally as a mod for Half-Life. As such, I found a lot of similarities between it and the feel of other Gold Source games. Early 3D graphics, compressed sound, slightly floaty controls. There's a weird charm that comes with playing games from this part of gaming that I don't get from any other of its time. I think it's because everything has been so well preserved. Last I played Counter-Strike, it still runs as smooth as ever, but everything else is locked in a time capsule from the late 90s and early 2000s. There's not much else I can really say about the original Counter-Strike. I don't have any notes on the balancing or any competitive aspects. All I can say is that it plays pretty well. The problem is that there's not much of a reason to play this game these days. Maybe if you grew up with the title or just looking for a throwback, but it's no longer supported as an esport, and the community, while still there, is way smaller than the current game. And you can probably guess that those who have stuck around this long have gotten pretty good at the game, so newcomers might have a hard time keeping up. If you really want to play it, it probably won't be a terrible time, just don't set your expectations too high.
6 out of 10!
Alright, I'm at a loss for this one. Counter-Strike Condition Zero just feels like Counter-Strike again. I seriously don't know what's different. I even looked up the Wikipedia page on this one, and it just said, yeah, it's basically Counter-Strike, but like a little prettier. Yeah, I guess so, but it doesn't look that much better anyway. Not sure why anyone would play this these days. I don't hear any conversation about a competitive scene if there ever was one. I honestly thought they went straight from Counter-Strike to CS Source, but here we are. All I can say is that it's Counter-Strike again. I don't even think there's that much new stuff in it besides the looks. And I can't find anyone to play with these days, so all I could do was play with bots. If you really want to play this game for some reason, then I don't think it'll be the worst thing in the world, but just why?
4 out of 10!
So they tried to do something different with Counter-Strike Condition Zero deleted scenes. Counter-Strike isn't known for its narrative. In fact, before this game, it never really had one from what I can recall. It was always about the multiplayer action. That's where Counter-Strike was best, and honestly, it's where it should have stayed, because the approach to deleted scenes did not work out if you ask me. What they tried to do was make some kind of single-player campaign out of the Counter-Strike name. It probably made sense to try, as Counter-Strike itself branched off of a narrative shooter. However, one problem with Counter-Strike is that the series doesn't really have any characters or narrative to pick from. The whole franchise is just made up of generic terrorist versus counter-terrorist scenarios. So we're already off to a bad start. What the developers did in this instance was set up a bunch of scenarios around the globe, all centering around that T versus CT dynamic. Different locations, slightly different objectives, that sort of thing. However, I don't really think this worked out either. What came as a result of this was a bunch of disjointed levels that all felt mediocre to some extent. The biggest hurdle deleted scenes had to get over was to actually get me to care about a Counter-Strike campaign. I love Counter-Strike, but it was never about the global fight to save the world from terrorism. It was just about shooting each other. So these levels in turn all just felt like generic shooter levels. All it really did was make me want to play some actual Counter-Strike.
3 out of 10!
Counter-Strike Global Offensive, or CSGO, has the most hours logged on any game I have on Steam, and it's not close. Back when I was really into this game, it was more of a lifestyle than a video game. I wanted to be the best of the best. I played every day grinding matches, getting my friends to play, doing aim practice just to get my rank up high enough. Unfortunately for me, no matter how much time or effort I put into the game learning nade spots, I could not make it out of silver. It kinda hurt, all things considered. Competitive CSGO looked really cool. I followed every major, lots of smaller tournaments too. Every player was so on point all the time because CSGO was all about precision. Throwing grenades into specific places to block the other team, being able to stop, place, and fire your shot within a split second to take someone out, putting your team in strategic locations to defend the crucial bomb sites or pierce a weakness. I found it all very fascinating, but in the actual game, I couldn't get around how bad I was at it. But still, CSGO holds a special place in my heart. I have a lot of memories tied to this game one way or another. Whether it's in watching tournaments or grinding out wins with my team, the gameplay is so deep that if you played on the same map over and over, each game would still find a way to be different. My only real problem with it was that things could get really toxic really fast. If you got queued with the wrong person, the whole game could derail within rounds and teammates would start killing each other or feeding the other team or just talking shit on comms. It's kind of upsetting, and it also started to turn me into a toxic player, so eventually I left and never looked back. But that doesn't change how fun CSGO can be. It has a lot to offer. Just be careful out there and bring some friends if you can.
8 out of 10!
I don't even know why this is called Counter-Strike. This feels like some Garry's Mod map got its own slot on the Steam store page. It just feels like a weird CS source mod. I don't get it. Well, it's probably okay not to get it, because the game isn't very good anyways. It can be fun for the novelty of playing a Counter-Strike zombie game, but it doesn't have much value beyond that. As a standalone game, it feels slapped together with duct tape and hot glue. Everything decent about it just comes from CS Source, or whichever game this is placed on top of. Even as a zombie game, why would you play this? Play Left 4 Dead or COD Zombies or anything else and you'd have more fun. That is, unless you like weird games like this. If that's you, then more power to you, but I've tried multiple times and each session I can't stay for more than 3 rounds. It's just the same stuff over and over. It doesn't look great and it sounds awful. All it really does is make me want to play some actual Counter-Strike. And then Garry's Mod.
2 out of 10!
I remember having a good time with Dishonored, but for some reason there's not a lot of images that stick with me after playing it. All I really have is a general look and game feel. There are maybe a couple reasons the game didn't stick with me as well as it should have. For starters, I'm not a fan of the art style. I can respect the team for doing something different for sure. It's much more than what other people were doing around the time, and it gives Dishonored its own identity. I just personally found it kind of ugly. Part of that is intentional, I realize. The game takes place in this dreary world full of disease and corruption,
option. Sounds like something I'd like on paper, but something just didn't work out for me. Playing this on PC, some things look jagged or just poorly textured. As much as I tried to fix that in the settings, I just had to accept that sometimes it just looks that way. The other issue I had was the story. It didn't feel very well set up in the beginning, and as the game went on, it went all over the place since it didn't really have the foundation. There is a great twist in there, but everything was just there or not set up properly. But Dishonored is a game, not a novel or a painting, and the gameplay side of things is really what sells it. Dishonored is a stealth game, but really, with the amount of options you have at your disposal, the game can really straddle the line between stealth and action. The best part about it though is that the abilities you have allow you to comfortably take either option as far as you want. You can get by without anyone spotting you, or you can murder everyone like some god of destruction. You are a little incentivized to stay hidden because if you kill lots of people, the game will adjust in an attempt to make things harder. However, with the amount of stuff you can do in this game, I really doubt it becomes a huge problem. Personally, I chose the sneaky approach as I find it more rewarding. Overall, I'd say Dishonored is a pretty good time on the merits of its gameplay. The issues I mentioned before does bring the experience down a bit, especially in those moments when they're front and center. But in those areas where you can let loose in the playground that is this game, it can be really fun.
8 out of 10!
Doki Doki Literature Club made a big splash when it first came out. It was a viral hit online with tons of let's plays and reactions on social media. The most clever part of the game, and no doubt the main reason it found such success, was that it was so good at keeping up its facade to unsuspecting players. Unless you were already spoiled, there was little if any chance you'd be able to pick up on what was really going on until it's too late. That's what makes the game so remarkable to me. The lengths it went to hide its true identity made the eventual reveal so impactful. After I played it, I immediately started asking my friends about their experience. I even convinced a couple of them to let me watch them play for the first time. Other than this, Doki Doki Literature Club isn't really the type of game I'd ever play. It's a visual novel, which is fine if you're into that, I guess, but I generally look for a more active experience. However, the one thing that visual novels can do better than most other games is tell a story. In most action games, story sequences have to be broken up by gameplay, but games like Doki Doki Literature Club can use the genre to provide an uninterrupted story sequence that, if done right, can really bring a player in. It's a shame, I feel, that the stereotype of most visual novel games is that they're just there to be horny. Doki Doki sort of makes fun of that stereotype, which is probably another point to why it stood out among the crowd. The only issue with playing Doki Doki Literature Club now is that the impact is gone. You can only play the game for the first time once, and after that I found it really hard to pick it up again. The only reason I'd download it again is if I found someone who hasn't heard of it yet, but for myself there really isn't a point anymore. But in that brief time when Doki Doki Literature Club was everywhere, it really did etch its mark into the culture. For that, I do think that it deserves credit.
8 out of 10!
I always thought Don't Starve was a strange game. It's a pretty obvious thing to say given just how it looks, but I also thought it was true of its gameplay. The game can be rather unforgiving in the beginning, and when I first got the game, I was having trouble getting past that first night. This wasn't like Minecraft where you could just hide in a hole if you weren't ready. In Don't Starve, if you don't know how to make a fire, then you're not going to survive the first night most times. Naturally, Don't Starve Together brings this experience online. You can join servers or just play in your own lobby. I found this to be more helpful since we could then work together to figure out the game's crafting system. It also helps that in the time between my first attempt and my last, either the game was updated or I got more patient. The stress of trying to figure everything out by the first night definitely made me a bit scatterbrained back then, but in my last attempt I noticed there were some helpful recipes that helped me find what I needed. Unfortunately though, after making it through the first few nights, I wasn't really feeling the drive to keep going. I may be spoiled by Minecraft because the gameplay didn't feel as interesting after that first mystery was solved. Don't Starve Together was interesting for sure, but not in a I need to keep playing this sort of way. I liked the art and working together was fun, but the gameplay just didn't hook me in the same way. I know there's a lot you can do with this game. I've seen videos, and going online I've seen structures and servers that look pretty cool, but nothing about them motivated me to make anything myself. I don't doubt that I'd have fun doing so, but it isn't my top priority, especially if no one's around to play with me.
6 out of 10!
DubWars is a bullet hell shooter based around dubstep. You fly around the screen avoiding enemies and shooting to the beat of the song. It seems like a cool idea, until you realize this is really all DubWars is. You get a decent amount of songs to choose from, but it's all the same setup. Shoot automatically with the music, try to weave around the enemies as you make it through the song. I know I already sound redundant, and that's because what I described is the game. If you don't like this premise, then you're not gonna like this game. Personally, I found it interesting, but it didn't get me pumped to play every song. By the third level, I realized that all the game was doing for me was giving my hands something to do while I listened to the music. So why not just listen to the soundtrack and do something else? The shooting is cool and the controls are fine. You kind of slide around the screen, which is a feature I'm not a huge fan of for these types of games, but you're in a spaceship, so whatever. Physics, I guess. The main problem is that the colors are so loud. Every song is an assault of bright colors on my eyes. I thought it looked cool for the first song, but the longer I played, the more my eyes hurt. It also got really hard to make out enemies from all the noise, which extra sucks for a game like this since that's the whole point. If you find yourself wanting DubWars, I'd recommend looking up the soundtrack instead. There's a lot of great music in it, but not much else.
3 out of 10.
I'm not really sure where to begin on this review. My history with Dust and Elysian Tale is a bit long-winded, and even though I can say I like the game quite a bit in action, I'm much more conflicted while writing. Dust was the first Metroidvania I ever bought. Back in the day, I was looking to branch out from the usual Marios and Sonics and whatever other Wii games I was playing, and a review I saw said it was pretty good. In turn, Dust and Elysian Tale was one of the first Steam games I ever had, if not the first. But when I tried to play it, it was bugged and unplayable, so I left it uninstalled and forgot about it for years. Fast forward a while, I've since become a fan of the genre after playing games like Ori and the Blind Forest and Fez, among others, and every time I booted up Steam I could see Dust just sitting in my library. It had been so long since I had even wanted to play it, but the idea of never playing it felt a little unjust to my younger self. I mean, I bought it with my own money. I did really want to play this at some point, but even though I wasn't the same kid anymore, I felt like I had to. After making this list, I finally re-downloaded the game. Happy to see the bugs were fixed after all these years, I got ready to play. As I played through, I started to get back to where I was however many years ago, and I did have a lot of fun. Dust mechanically is pretty well done. While the combat can get repetitive at points, it's no less satisfying to rip through foes with sword and magic combos, trying to see how high you can get that combo counter up. The exploration and progression is also quite fun. It isn't that much different than other games in the genre, and it does have some backtracking as well, but I didn't have many issues with getting stuck or bored. No, I was just enjoying the ride. The main thing I'm conflicted on is the presentation. A lot of things like the environments and combat animations look really good, but in other areas it feels lacking. I think they may have bitten off a little more than they can chew with the presentation, and the execution of it feels a little uneven as a result. The story also does not do it for me. The writing and acting is all over the place as well. Some great voice acting and some cool character interactions, but mostly just middle of the road or straight up bad. The music is great, however. The main things that kept me going through the whole game was the gameplay, exploration, and of course the nostalgia. The actual game part of this game is genuinely well done, but the stuff surrounding it is take it or leave it.
7 out of 10.
The concept of Evoland is a pretty cool one. If you don't know already, Evoland is an RPG love letter. The main idea is that the player can open chests to progress through different eras of gaming, going all the way from 8-bit to 32. Along the way, Evoland comes with a bunch of references to series like Final Fantasy, Zelda, and other RPG/adventure games that I've never heard of. It's really cool to see these references correlate with the different evolutions of the world. I just realized that's probably why it's called Evoland. Either way, I love this idea. It allows the developer to get really creative with the world, not just with the art and the references, but with its gameplay as well. Imagine hopping between 16-bit and 32-bit to solve a puzzle. It seems cool. Keep thinking about that too, because that doesn't really happen in Evoland. Unfortunately, while this gimmick is really fun, I don't feel like it was taken advantage of. Actually, the progression from one time to the next is pretty linear. Something I found a little weird considering the genre we're working with. But honestly, after playing Evoland all the way through, it makes sense. Evoland is more like a showcase than a full-on game. You can get a few hours out of it for sure, but its linear progression and simple story makes it feel like it was just a means to show off this concept. Evoland is fun in that aspect, but as a game, it doesn't really do anything for me. It's cool for novelty, but that's about it.
6 out of 10.
Evoland 2 has a much more fleshed out vision for the Evoland idea. What we have here is a full-on RPG, featuring time travel that corresponds to different graphical and gameplay styles. Now I won't dare to try to unravel the time travel plot this game has. I'm not a skilled enough writer to see if there are any holes, but if it can get by me while I played the game from beginning to end, I think I can say it did a decent job. The gameplay of Evoland 2 is still pretty bare as you may expect. We're still dealing with an indie title, and it's clear most of the effort went into the plot. I can't be too mad at that, all things considered. A lot of things feel surface level in the gameplay department, and sometimes the devs just put in complete genre shifts for the sake of a reference. A little jarring, but it's nothing too frustrating. Sometimes it serves the story, so I guess I can give it a pass. Yes, I do feel the moment-to-moment gameplay is lacking, but it's still perfectly functional at the end of the day. Talking about Evoland's signature progression theme, I'm glad to see it become more integral to the game. In Evoland 1, it felt more like a showcase, but in Evoland 2, it's a full-on element of the world. I particularly like how affecting the environment in one era changes another. It's exactly the thing I was looking for, and this game has quite a few interesting sequences featuring it. The actual story of Evoland 2 was a bit of a ride. I felt quite a bit of it was not very interesting. The story felt really run-of-the-mill, and I won't lie, I was thinking of quitting at a few points due to how bored I got. I spent many hours, and all I saw was a really basic time travel plot with almost zero character progression. But the final act saved the game for me. I won't spoil too much in case someone wants to play it, but things really got off the ground at that point. Character arcs were moving, including for our silent protagonist. All of a sudden, I was really interested all the way up to the ending that I really shouldn't spoil, but man, it was so cool. I kinda hate being this guy, but if you give it a chance, it does get really good. I realize that's a hard thing to ask of people. Hell, I barely ever listen to that advice myself, especially since it's an RPG, which are known to go on for tens of hours. And while Evoland 2 isn't the longest RPG, my playthrough was still around 20 hours. But as someone who doesn't play this genre outside of Pokemon, I've found it really enjoyable in the end. That's gotta be worth something, right?
7 out of 10!
Fez is a weird case of a game. Originally a star of the documentary indie game The Movie, the game has since faded into obscurity along with its creator. Nowadays, it's hard to find someone who remembers Fez. It wasn't on any of my friends' radars until I introduced it to them, which always shocks me. Not only was I a fan of the documentary it was in, but the game itself has provided some of the most fun experiences I can ask for in a video game. The crux of Fez is its 2D, 3D gameplay, where every area in this Metroidvania-like world is 3D, but can only be viewed on a 2D lens. The player can rotate the world in 90-degree increments to get a new angle and a brief view into where everything actually lies. This gimmick is Fez's signature, a brilliant one at that. It's one that gives tons of possibilities for puzzles and platforming challenges, and the game takes full advantage. Starting off with the more basic puzzles and growing into absurd degrees as the player unfolds the rest of the map, the biggest criticism I've seen of Fez is that some puzzles can be really cryptic, and I absolutely understand where that's coming from. I mean, there are puzzles that require knowledge of coding, in-game languages, and even a QR code. I was put off by this on my first time through and did my best to skirt those challenges on the road to beating it. Then I came back another time around with the intent of full completion, and when I actually tried those puzzles, I had a fantastic time. I can't remember the last game that made me take out a notebook, and it was fascinating reading through forum posts like a detective. In a way, these otherwise ridiculous asks of the player turned the online search into its own ingenious little game. But Fez is also more than its puzzles. It also has a really charming presentation, with cute characters and a beautiful world. One that is deeper than it may look at first. And I can't go so long without mentioning Fez's music. The chiptune sounds come in atmospheric at points, others contemplative, melancholy, or just plain groovy. And it has become one of my favorite game soundtracks of all time, for how well it fits into the game and how well it stands on its own. The only real problem I had consistently was the map. The map can be hard to decipher, especially when most of the rooms have been discovered. It looks like a mess, but I learned to get used to it and appreciate how it tried to simplify a complicated 3D maze space for the player. The map isn't enough to tarnish the amazing things the rest of this game manages to accomplish on all other levels, and every time I play Fez, I like it more. I know to some of my friends I may sound like a broken record recommending this game over and over, but hopefully this can illuminate why, to me, this is one of the best games I've ever played.
Oh my god, it's a 10 out of 10!
Firewatch was a nice change of pace from the other more action-packed games I usually play. It's not for everyone, but the narrative adventure was intriguing and the presentation was spectacular. While it doesn't have much else to offer, it was those two things that really kept me going. In fact, you may know Firewatch more for its imagery rather than its gameplay. While the focus of the game is on narrative, it is still a game. In said game, you'll be walking around the forest you oversee, talking to a coworker on the radio and solving mysteries by finding new areas and picking up items. It's certainly not slaying monsters or saving princesses, but I actually found the gameplay of Firewatch to be quite relaxing, even therapeutic. By keeping everything simple, you get more room to take in the forest. It's quiet, and it can be at the same time serene and eerie depending on the context of your expeditions. In this sense, Firewatch does a great job of replicating the feeling of being alone in the wild. One of the main talking points around the game's release was its ending. I feel a lot of people, including myself to an extent, were disappointed by the ending of Firewatch. You spent the whole game going down this rabbit hole only to have the conclusion ripped from you at the very end. But as time has gone on, I've come to appreciate this ending. Yeah, it sucks that you never get that satisfaction, but I think that was the point. Let's think about it from Henry's point of view. The man comes out to the forest to do a job, and gets sucked into this long-winded conspiracy only to be rudely interrupted at the very end by the one thing he was sent there to look out for. It's kind of ironic in a sense, and indicative of where he is as a person, and to an extent where the player may be as they enable this behavior. Firewatch isn't so much about that mystery as it is about exploring isolation, distant relationships, and finding yourself. Maybe I just played it at the right time, but that really connected with me. Could it have been better written? Maybe, but I think it still got its point across to me. Or maybe I'm crazy and it all sucks, but what's cool about these games is that it's really up to your own interpretation. No, Firewatch is not the most exciting game ever made. Perhaps it could have done more, but I had a good time all the way through, and that's really all a game needs to do.
7 out of 10!
How is the Five Nights at Freddy's franchise doing? I remember FNAF exploding into the scene with the first game and riding that high for a while. Or what felt like a while, even though there was a new game every 6 months. After Security Breach, I feel like the FNAF train is finally slowing down. Or maybe I'm just out of touch. Either way, we're here to talk about the first game, the viral hit, the original Five Nights at Freddy's. Like most people, I assume, I first heard of the game through online Let's Plays, specifically Markiplier's. Back when it came out, it did look legitimately scary. The concept of a horror game where you're completely helpless to even move was new to the mainstream, and heightened feelings of anticipation, stress, dread, and other synonyms for fear. It really was the most bang for your buck horror at the time. Five Nights at Freddy's is a pretty cheaply made horror game, but developer Scott Cawthon made it work in the game's favor. Most people nowadays are super wrapped up in the series' lore, but shockingly, compared to other games, the first FNAF doesn't have that much to offer. You get some very vague backstory for why these animatronics are hunting you down, a couple unanswered questions to keep fans engaged, or if you're cynical like me, to excuse bad writing. Most of the lore applied to this game is retroactive. That said, playing this game recently was very different from when it first came out. It wasn't scary anymore, which makes these old Let's Play titles really funny to me, by the way. No, instead it turned into a management game. I will say the coolest part of the first FNAF to me was learning the patterns of each animatronic. Some of them have audio or visual cues, others follow a certain pattern, and this knowledge has turned the game into a really different experience. But to be honest, the amount of focus you need to complete later sections of the game kind of ruins the atmosphere. The animatronics aren't scary at that point, they're annoying. You don't have time to look for secrets in the pizzeria or even listen to the phone guy or anything like that. Personally, that's what made the game so interesting in the first place. So I feel really split down the middle in this one. It's cool to come back to the title because of its significance, but playing it now is certainly not like its heyday, with so much retroactive muddy lore and a stressful completion experience that distracts from what makes the franchise interesting in the first place. But it does get points for being the first in the series, founding that groundbreaking design format that the rest of the series would iterate on.
Six out of 10!
Five Nights at Freddy's 2 actually seems like a pretty standard sequel from a gameplay standpoint. I guess in a more old school sense of the term, what I mean is that FNAF 2 seems like it was made for those who had mastered the first game, by adding more animatronics to consider and taking away some things that could be considered as crutches, namely the retractable doors. See, in the first game, if you had enough power for the end of the night, you could realistically just close all the doors and hermit yourself until the night ended, but no more. Now you have to be on your toes the whole time time. This change made the animatronics a bit more intimidating as well, because you can see them coming from all directions, but now there's nothing stopping them from walking straight into your office. The other animatronics can be a bit much to manage though. There's only so many things I can keep track of at one time, and FNAF 2 is constantly pushing that line. It's for this reason that I failed to make it through all the nights on this one. But other than that, this game has most of the same ups and downs as the first one. From a lore standpoint, the game seemed to raise more questions than answers when it first came out. Theories were everywhere at this point, and it's where I kind of lost interest as well. Well, what I mean is that I was into the lore, but it only took until the second game for it to overshadow the actual gameplay. It was way more enjoyable to watch videos on YouTube than to play the actual game. And so initially, FNAF 2 put a bad taste in my mouth. It seemed to intentionally leave breadcrumbs in order to string its audience along for this long and convoluted journey. And that can be fun and all, but at the end of the day, I'm playing it for the game, and if your game is still the same as the last one, then I'm not gonna buy in anymore. Thanks.
5 out of 10.
Freedom Planet is one of those games I just kind of made my way through. Some cool moments, some little complaints, but overall it was just a fun ride. You can probably already tell that Freedom Planet is based off Sonic. It's the main reason I bought the game, as weirdly enough I haven't heard of a lot of indie takes on the gameplay. Okay, I'm kidding. It's actually kind of hard to avoid Sonic fan games these days, but Freedom Planet intrigued me by presenting a completely different and original world and characters. So I could get the Sonic gameplay I like along with a new story to follow. So what's not to like? Well, in practice, the story isn't really that interesting. It's cool to have full voice acting and cutscenes and all that, you know, to flesh things out, but it didn't end up as engaging as it could have. What I'm saying is there's a decent chance you've seen a version of it before. So the story isn't much to write home about, but the gameplay was pretty good all things considered. You have multiple characters to play with in Freedom Planet, each with different abilities. For my playthrough, I just stuck with Lilac, the closest thing to the main character. She has a fun dash ability that blends really well with the level designs and the boss fights. In fact, I think the boss fights were the coolest part of the game. They're really flashy and they have some crazy moves that can get pretty hard towards the end, but taking one down is always really satisfying. That's really all I have of note to say about Freedom Planet. It didn't blow me away or disappoint me very much outside of those aspects. Everything else is just indicative of a decent platformer. Decent level design, fun moves, good flow, all that. You can play a classic mode that skips the story stuff if you're not into that. So if you feel like playing a new platformer, I'd say, why not?
7 out of 10.
Reviewing Garry's mod is weird. In essence, it's like reviewing a game engine rather than a game. For this review, I'm going to focus on the player experience rather than the mechanical ins and outs of the game. This is because I spent most of my time with Garry's mod playing different game modes, not making YouTube shorts or maps or creations of my own. While Garry's mod is an incredibly versatile game for that sort of stuff, and it absolutely gets points for that, I took a more relaxed approach. The main games I'd play on Gmod were Trouble in Terrorist Town and Prop Hunt. Prop Hunt in particular was my favorite of the two. It's a simple concept and it's really easy to join in any server and start playing, as you don't really need any communication to play. TTT, however, is only really fun if you have a group of people you know, because public sessions would usually turn into a deathmatch since no one wanted to actually talk. Next to those two, I probably spent a good amount of time in the sandbox just messing around with the tons of items Gmod has at its disposal. I also had a ton of custom player models, probably my favorite standalone feature of Gmod, as it allows you to give yourself some identity. Now, Garry's mod was really fun back in the day, but I'm not sure if I was just blind or if things have gotten worse, because playing it now feels like downloading malware. Every server you join requires you to download a ton of custom models, and it's hard to find a populated server that isn't riddled with ads. It no longer felt like a means to play silly games with friends, it felt like the game was trying to trick me into buying something. To be fair, Gmod is not the only game that has this problem. Custom servers in all source games have this nowadays, but when it makes its way into your main mode like in Gmod, then it becomes a lot more noticeable and makes the game a lot less enticing for me to play. But Garry's mod still has a lot to offer, and to be fair, I've never actually gotten a virus from the game. It just leaves a sour taste in my mouth. Gmod can provide hours upon hours of fun by yourself or with friends with the amount of things it can do. It's just not the prettiest experience to get.
6 out of 10.
I don't think there's much to say about Grow Home. It's one of those games that really hunkers down on one premise and sees that through rather than throwing tons of things at you to add time or variety. It's a focused experience, and that means you can probably figure out if you like it or not off of a quick impression. So allow me to explain Grow Home's main mechanic. It's climbing. You play as a little robot named Bud, who fell a great distance away from their ship and now has to climb their way back to the ship, exploring the planet along the way. It's a simple concept, and that simplistic attitude makes its way into all aspects of the game. You've got a low-poly 3D art style, one that I wish was more prominent these days as I find it really charming. There's also a more atmospheric soundtrack for most of the adventure, and I also really like the control layout in this game. Rather than a more automated climbing experience like, say, Breath of the Wild, Grow Home makes you control each of Bud's hands individually, which turns climbing into a rhythmic back and forth on the controller. All of this makes Grow Home a pretty zen game. There's no bad guys, there's no other characters besides Bud and the ship's computer, it's just you and the environment, and a few sheep. During my playthrough, I found Grow Home to be a decent wind-down game due to its simplicity, rhythmic gameplay, and focus on atmosphere rather than action. But Grow Home isn't all sunshine and rainbows, because while all this works in theory, in the game itself I ran into some issues. First off, for a game where positioning is so important, I'm surprised by how loose the controls felt. When Bud walks around, they feel really heavy. It takes a long time for them to start and stop, and on anything other than a flat surface, they'll slip and slide all over the place. This gets to be more prominent later on as you get higher and the amount of solid ground gets smaller. Falling down at that point is infuriating because you can lose tons of progress and it doesn't always feel like your fault. Finally, by the end of the game, dealing with all the issues along the way, I just felt whelmed. I couldn't decide if I really enjoyed what I had played or if it was just something to do. Grow Home is a good game, no doubt, but it's not a game that was ever begging to be played, if you catch my drift. Lots of other games will hook you in and then keep that dopamine pumping with tons of new stuff. But in Grow Home, what you do in the first 10 minutes is the same thing you'll be doing in the last 10. Climbing.
6 out of 10!
The reports are in, and Guns of Icarus Online is a dead game. It had been a while since I had last played. The numbers were dwindling back then, but it was still possible to find a game. Nowadays, the number of concurrent players rarely goes above 10 people. That's 1-0, not even enough for a full game. So yeah, I know the servers are still online and some lonely souls are still playing it, but I'm calling time on this one. It's not like I want to either. I played a good amount of Guns of Icarus at its peak, and it was an amazing time. There really wasn't a game like it back then. Having to work together to man the ship, it was fun with friends or with strangers, and the steampunk aesthetic was very cool. I could pick any role and have a good time because I knew I was contributing. The frantic nature of battle and working towards a common goal set the stage for lots of crazy and fun moments. But the game is pretty much unplayable now. There's no way to get the full experience unless you can somehow convince like 6 of your friends to play this decade-old game. If you can do that, then I think you'll have a good time for at least a few games, but for the average person, Guns of Icarus Online is practically unapproachable.
0 out of 10!
Half-Life 2 underwhelmed me, and the sad part is that it had nothing to do with the actual game. It's got a decent story, fun shooting, and lots of cool set pieces and other segments, but I think I was burnt out from before I even booted it up. Half-Life 2 is an iconic title. It's known around the internet for a bunch of stuff. Its opening segment, the Combine, Ravenholm, and of course the lack of a full-on follow-up. Not to mention the engine on its own has sort of evolved into its own aesthetic thanks to the sheer amount of content using it. So Half-Life 2 was already etched in my brain before I started playing. Going through it, there were multiple moments where what should have been a big moment was undercut by a, oh yeah, that's from that video I watched. There was no twist, no cool little Easter egg or reference, no. All the secrets this game had were already shown to me years ago. With the impact essentially gone, I was left with a fine FPS game. A game with a solid progression with maybe a few bumps along the way. Highway 17 comes to mind as one of the less interesting segments, and Sand Traps was downright awful, having to play the floor is lava on the Source engine, which isn't that good at platforming. But yeah, I don't think I have much to say about Half-Life 2. I mean, what is there to say that hasn't been told already? It did a lot for the industry and all that, really affected the culture too. On its own, it's a fun shooter. Even with everything spoiled, I can still say I had a good time for most of the adventure. Of course, it wasn't able to wow me, but if you've somehow avoided spoilers for this game, you might like it even more than I did. If you have seen it though, and it's still not interesting to you, then you're probably better off playing something else.
7 out of 10!
Half-Life 2 Episode 1 takes place directly after Half-Life 2, and I mean immediately after. The game is much shorter than the base game, but that was certainly intentional given the approach and name. I actually liked Episode 1 a bit more than the base game upon first playthrough. The shorter length really forced the team to pick up the pace, and Episode 1 feels a lot more straightforward than the previous entry. There's not as much meandering around, and I felt invested the whole time. The base game Half-Life 2 had to do a lot of setup. It had been a while since the last game, both in the timeline and in real life, so a good chunk of the game was taken setting up characters and the new world, and then it had you wandering around for a bit before things actually got moving. Episode 1 doesn't need to retread old ground, so you can hop right in and you know what you need to do. Now you can have that wonderful Half-Life gameplay with more urgency and purpose. I like the heavier emphasis on the gravity gun towards the beginning. I like the progression of the story as it kind of reminds me of Half-Life 1 trying to escape the facility. I also really like going through it all with Alex. Gordon Freeman is a stone cold man at this point, at least in my mind. He's been here before, but Alex keeps things grounded. Her voice actress does an amazing job selling it too. So yeah, Half-Life 2 Episode 1 was pretty good in my eyes. It had the same tight gameplay, and it upped the pace, and it had more interesting maps on average too. The episodic approach does mean it's not a great recommend as a standalone title, given its shorter length and disregard for context, but with the other games under my belt, I can safely say it was a great time.
8 out of 10!
Half-Life 2 Episode 2 is pretty infamous these days. Not so much for the game itself, but rather what it promised at the end. Episode 2 left a cliffhanger that still has yet to be resolved. It was a shocking moment to leave the series on. When I got there myself, I couldn't believe that this was the last thing to happen in the story. The Half-Life episodes are a 3-act play with 2 acts. It's not like you couldn't guess where the story was going at the end of Episode 2, but it felt like a letdown knowing that we still wouldn't get to experience the, probably, final piece of the puzzle. Knowing that this story still hasn't been resolved not only feels like a bit of a slight to the audience, but also to Alex's character. But let's take a few steps back. Episode 2 is more than just the final scene, and while that will probably forever overshadow the rest of the game, I'm here to talk about my overall experience, not just how upset I am at the ending. The story as a whole for Episode 2 was quite good. Once again, you were dropped right in with a clear direction, and you can make your way without any unnecessary setup or fluff. The gameplay though did feel like it got in the way of that at points. There's the car sequence where you go from random abandoned town to town fighting soldiers. The fights themselves were good, but the constant stopping from place to place felt like a bit of a pace breaker. My least favorite part had to be those sequences where you had to play tower defense against waves and waves of enemies. Running around in circles trying to kill these guys was not very fun for me, and I just wanted it to end so we could get back to the story. That's kind of what it felt like, some extra challenge thrown in so that the game wasn't too short, and they did it twice. I'll say again, Half-Life 2 gameplay is good, but the ups and downs are due to more scenarios and map design rather than controls or mechanics. It just felt like they were more of a hindrance to the plot than a complement to it. Half-Life 2 Episode 2 was still a good time, but it wasn't my favorite in the Half-Life 2 series. It had a good story and the gameplay was still fun in its own right. I just felt more of a mismatch between the two compared to say Episode 1. And I mean, it's still not that long, so the problems may sound bad, but they don't stick around too much. Episode 2 is still a game you should play if you're going through the Half-Life games. It's the latest in the timeline, closely connected to the others, necessary reading, basically. And it's not a bad read, it just has some problems.
6 out of 10!
Half-Life 2 Deathmatch isn't a dead game per se, but it's so close. Going online, you'll find a lot of servers, but only a handful of them will have some people in them. Playing the game is like playing any other deathmatch. You get a little more freedom with the servers, some have cool custom maps or other mods like limited weapons or low gravity or stuff like that. All of that is cool, but in the state Half-Life 2 Deathmatch is in, you won't really get much of a choice of servers. If you want to go, you'll have to go where the people are, and at that point the choice has been made for you. It's this problem that ends up breaking these multiplayer exclusive games. There will always be some people online who play, but at the numbers it's at, there isn't really a point for newcomers. This then stops the flow of engagement and the game slowly dies. It practically breaks the game, or at least becomes extremely alienating. And it no longer matters how good of a game Half-Life 2 Deathmatch was or can be, because, well, who's even gonna play it?
1 out of 10!
Half-Life 2 Lost Coast is just a tech demo. No need to waste your time here, it's just a showcase for what was then the new Source engine. I thought maybe Valve will do some weird shit and tie their demo into the plot somehow. Seems like a Valve thing to do, right? Well, no, it's just a demo. The whole thing is maybe 30 minutes max if you want to play it for novelty or nostalgia or whatever, it'll be fine, but you really don't need to waste your time.
3 out of 10.
Oh look, another dead multiplayer game. Half-Life Deathmatch Source was still barely breathing a few years ago when I first made this list. I actually managed to get into a game with other people and it was pretty fun. My original score for the game was a 6 because of that, but now I can't find a single server with anyone in it. Maybe it has to do with where I'm located, but at the end of the day, it probably doesn't matter. Half-Life Deathmatch Source was fun for that one game, and if you can find something like that, then good on you, but on the whole, the game is just dead.
0 out of 10.
Another game that was sitting in my library for a long time before I actually booted it up. Hotline Miami had quite the reputation for its tight gameplay, its weird story, and above all, its over-the-top violence. I think what kept me from playing for so long was that I just wasn't down for a game like that. I still intended to play it at some point. I mean, I've been listening to the soundtrack well beforehand. Hotline Miami is about gangs and drugs and going on killing sprees. It does nothing to sugarcoat the insanity of such situations. You'll be hallucinating one scene and beating people's heads in the next, tearing down men one by any means necessary, all to the tune of some 80s synth jams. This is all an attempt to bring you in and sort of hypnotize you, I feel. The story makes no sense, and that's on purpose. There isn't a surface level reason to go out killing these people, you're just told to by some guy on the phone. When you beat a level and the music abruptly stops, it's like quickly sobering up. To this end, I feel Hotline Miami does a great job. It helps that the gameplay is really tight and creative. You will die in only 1 or 2 hits, but the game takes no time in putting you back into the action, and it pushes you to try new options and figure out a path through trial and error. By the end, I knew the layouts back, forth, and upside down. It turned me into an efficient digital killing machine. The worst part is that it's all really fun, but it's not all fun. The trial and error nature means lots and lots of repetition. I started to get frustrated. I'd get headaches from all the bright colors and loud music. Not all of it feels like my fault either. Enemies in Hotline Miami are usually set on one of 3 modes. They'll either stand still, patrol a set path, or wander around randomly. The random ones are always a pain in the ass to deal with, because no amount of memorization can prepare you for them. You just have to pray they stay where you want them. Also, some levels get pretty big and enemies off screen will kill you before you get to see them. That feels cheap, and combined with the guys I mentioned before, it can be a real buzzkill. But Hotline Miami is still a good experience. It's become pretty iconic in the indie scene, and for good reason. It can be a lot to take in, and I don't think all the levels are winners, but it was definitely a thrilling ride the whole time.
8 out of 10.
Hotline Miami 2 just feels like more of the first game to me. There's a few minor changes, but the essence is the same stuff. In this case, that's mostly a good thing. You've still got the addictive gameplay, a kickin' soundtrack, and trippy visuals, all stuff that really drew me in the first time and did the exact same here. There are some changes though, too. For one, the story is a little more involved this time. There's a lot more sequences going over story bits, and even though the story isn't the main focus, it forced me to pay more attention and pick up on some more details. Still as confusing as ever, but a little more in depth this time. The levels are also more in depth. There are more of them, and they tend to be longer than any level from the first game. All in all, it's a welcome change. The gameplay was my favorite part of the game, so more of it is a good thing. But I don't think the devs picked up on the problems with the overly expansive level design. There's a lot more open levels in Hotline Miami 2, and they get a lot more egregious with enemies shooting you from off screen or otherwise being unable to properly react to level elements. I think they toned down some of the random stuff, but when the level design is even more expansive, it creates more problems. Most of the time in the first game, I could skirt the off-screen guys and let them come to me, but this game will have you firing off-screen a lot, spraying and praying you'll hit something before they hit you. Hotline Miami 2 is on average the same insane shooting experience the first game was, so I'm gonna give it the same score. Same mechanics, same aesthetics, some new bells and whistles, and some minor things I would have liked left behind, but overall the same kind of trip.
8 out of 10.
I'm just gonna come right out and say that Human Resource Machine is probably not worth your time. It's not because it's a bad game, I think it's just a confused one. The game was made by the same people who made Little Inferno, if you remember that. Both that game and Human Resource Machine take a simple game concept usually meant for kids and put a dark twist on it. It's kind of what this studio was known for at this point. This game's concept of choice was coding. You ever take a basic coding class in elementary or middle school? The ones where you put blocks of words together to make like if-then statements, then hit play and watch your code in action. Human Resource Machine is exactly that on a mechanical level. The dark twist is that you're a corporate cog in the machine, having to waste away in a room fulfilling tasks to appease your bosses. In isolation, both of these ideas can work for a game. One is already a proven concept for teaching early coding, and the other can be an interesting commentary on the modern working experience. But together, these ideas just don't make sense to me. The kids who would usually do this coding stuff would be incredibly put off by the depressing scenario, and the adults who might find this commentary interesting have likely already decided whether or not they like coding, and the puzzle block gameplay is either going to be too easy or just unwanted. These two demographics just don't line up, and in the end I just wonder, who was this meant for? Functionally, everything is fine. The presentation is fine, it all works, there's just no reason to play this. If you want some coding practice, there's programs that will teach you without making you sad about humanity. And if you want some social commentary, believe me, we have a lot of that too. Putting these together just doesn't make sense, and it may work for shock value, but this is a game, and games take hours to beat, so don't bother with this.
5 out of 10.
Hyper Light Drifter feels like a special game to me. I'm not sure why, but something about it speaks to me. Almost everything about it, from its visuals to its story to its gameplay, clicks. Maybe I just happen to have the right background, having a liking towards open maps, pixelated visuals, and nonverbal storytelling. I love the art style of this game. Not just that it's pixel art, but the neon colors and geometric shapes and how it all permeates the environments to the characters. Hyper Light Drifter is a satisfying game to look at. The music is fantastic as well, thanks to Disasterpiece. The composer of Fez returns to deliver a wonderful atmospheric soundtrack, and their synthetic style blends wonderfully with the rest of the game's themes. Maybe that's why I like this game so much. One of the running themes of these reviews has been my obsession with atmosphere. How game developers can use all these mediums in a delicate dance to create a beautiful world. Everything from the main character to the trees to the caves and eerie monoliths feels like they belong together, creating an ultimate immersion. Even the gameplay follows this. Being a lone wolf in this dangerous world, you'd expect things to be tough, and Hyper Light Drifter recognizes that. You have a few tools at your disposal and a little buddy by your side, but you're ultimately alone, and combat can feel like a struggle for survival more than a way to flex your strength. It fits because no one wants you intruding on their land, but you have no other option. The fights are intense, and in turn the moments of calm are well cherished. This is the kind of flow that drew me into Hyper Light Drifter. I was only drawn out by looking for secrets. Hyper Light Drifter is a game that wants you to be immersed as often as possible, but the game also features a lot of secrets. Most of them can be found if you know how to look for them. Hints are given through the environment, context clues, and tricks of the camera, but not all of them are helped by this. And when you have to break your attention to look up a guide, the magic of the game is lost. I also found this to happen a few times with the controls. They feel just a tad loose to me, and this marginal lack of control can snowball in some instances and once again break the link between the game and the player. But Hyper Light Drifter is still a magnificent game to get lost in. The whole time I was mesmerized. I wanted to see everything. I wanted to know more about this world. Those breaks in immersion only happened because I was enticed to push the game as far as I could, because everything else is pretty much perfectly executed. So I implore you to give the game a try. It's a bit of a moody game, but if you're looking for a new experience to dive deep into, this is a great choice.
9 out of 10!
Jet Set Radio was a game that always captured my attention due to its style. It brandished its bold colors, loud music, and edgy, wacky premise like no other game of its time. Actually, I originally got the game because I thought it would be like Tony Hawk. I was playing Sega All-Stars Racing and saw a guy on rollerblades and thought to give it a try. Jet Set Radio is not like Tony Hawk. I guess it has a similar punk energy, but you can tell right off the bat that these are two different games with different setups and goals made by teams on different sides of the world. But even though it wasn't what I originally thought, I was brought in by other things. I thought the character designs were really cool in particular. I'd never seen a game get so wild with their visuals and then proceed to play it completely straight. It's a confidence that absolutely helped keep me engaged. That and the music. Jet Set Radio's music is some of the best video game music I've ever heard. It was and still is very unique. The developers knew how groovy it was too, because the music is in the forefront the whole time, playing song after song song in a playlist. On top of all this personality is a decent little gameplay experience too. There's some inherent fun in trying to stay on the rails as long as you can, racking up points and spraying all your graffiti spots before the cops get to you. The choice of multiple characters is nice too, allowing you to find one that fits you best with their tricks and how they spray paint. Jet Set Radio can get a bit frustrating at points. For one, the controls can be a lot to get used to. Turning can feel pretty stiff, and being on skates, your momentum is as if you're constantly on ice. These things can lead to problems during gameplay that can easily snowball and cause some frustration, because the game isn't exactly a cakewalk either. Jet Set Radio feels like it's constantly wading through some level of jank. Whether that be its controls, or level layouts, or certain challenges, the game doesn't feel fully thought out in some instances. But I suspect the reason these problems were overlooked was because the developers knew they had something special at the core, and most of their time was spent on that. Because despite all the problems it has, those things I can ignore as long as I keep hitting my lines and as long as the music keeps blasting.
7 out of 10!
Let's get scratching.
Kairo is a very strange game. It gives me the sense that it's trying to be one of those art piece games, but I don't think I get it. My main problem with it is that the way forward never really made sense to me. I got stuck plenty of times because I'd enter a room and nothing about the game would tell me what to do. I'd run around trying to find things to interact with, and if I did find something, it was never clear what that interaction produced. So in order to get through the game, I had to play the whole thing side by side with a guide. In which case, whatever magic the game was trying to conjure was ignored by me having to pause every 30 seconds to figure out what was going on. In previous reviews, I talked about guides and how some game experiences can be enhanced by guides, or at the very least not much affected by it, and how sometimes it can be detrimental. All of this depends on context, of course. Some games really want you to be glued to the screen at all times in order to take everything in, and introducing the need for a walkthrough then breaks that connection, feeling counterintuitive to how the game was intended to work. Others subtly encourage this multimedia approach or straight up break that wall for you, showing that using outside resources is acceptable. Kairo to me feels like the former. I felt the urge to get sucked in with the game's striking visuals and sounds. The cryptic nature could have worked in its favor, but in practice having to play this game with a guide turned the whole thing into a checklist. And at that point, Kairo didn't have much else keeping me going. I still beat it because I already had the guide up on my screen, but all in all, it wasn't a great experience.
3 out of 10!
So we've got another drug-fueled 80s action-inspired game featuring brightly colored pixel art and an over-the-top amount of violence. But this time, Katana Zero manages to hit all the marks for me instead of most. The game's main gimmick is time manipulation. At any point during a level, you can activate a bullet time-esque mode wherein you can give yourself more time to react to enemies and whatnot. It's nice to give players something like this, since without it, Katana Zero would be incredibly tough and possibly turn off some players that way. At the same time, going without bullet time is tough, but it's not impossible. More hardcore players can learn the maps and timings in and out and manage to get by the game without using this feature at all. Whenever I manage to clear a room without it, for a moment I feel like a real ninja. Next to the gameplay, my favorite aspect of the game has to be the story. Story sequences and gameplay sequences start out very separate from one another, but as the game goes on, they start to do this fusion dance and the lines between game and cutscene get blurred. It fit very well with the game's themes, and it's a nice showcase for how the medium can enhance storytelling. It's also nice that you have an effect on the character interactions with control over how you respond to dialogue. The plot took me on a wild ride, not just filled with dumb action, but mystery, horror, joy, and sadness. Katana Zero surprised me with just how consistently entertaining it was. I didn't even mention the visuals or music yet, which are also top notch. Music to fit every situation, including some really banging electronic tracks for some action stages, and the dynamic lighting over the great pixel art and animation just ties a nice bow over it all. I've only played Katana Zero relatively recently compared to the rest of my list, but I've since gone back multiple times and it's just as good every time. My only wish is, when can we get more?
Oh my god, it's a 10 out of 10!
Left 4 Dead 2 has always been a great kickback game to play with friends. Of course, zombie games are a little overdone these days, but even now the co-op gameplay that Left 4 Dead 2 provides brings a lot of fun to the table. It's that co-op setup that makes the game stand out from the crowd. The game is meant to be played with other people, and when you get a full squad, you can usually bet on a pretty good time. The individual gameplay in Left 4 Dead 2 isn't exactly special. First-person shooter, lots of weapons to play with, like bats and grenades and all sorts of guns. It's stuff that's been done before, and it's not really what drew me in. Not even the special zombie types on their own do that much for me. It's just a way to add some spice to your zombie slaying action. While none of these elements are anything of note on their own, it's when you add multiple players to the mix that things start to take shape. In a single player environment, the special infected aren't much more than another obstacle, but in co-op they force your group to work together and make crucial decisions. It's also why I never liked playing Left 4 Dead 2 by myself. When your teammates are all replaced with computers, the magic is lost. The other cool part of Left 4 Dead 2 I want to mention is the workshop. Downloading random models to replace characters and zombies in the game made for a lot of funny moments, like hearing your friend needs help and running over to find they're being mauled by a rabid Diddy Kong. The amount of options in the workshop is great too. Community members put a lot of work in to make the game that much better. Left 4 Dead 2 has rarely ever let me down. It's always a great option if you and your friends need something to play, and there's plenty there to keep you playing for a good amount of time. My only problem is that playing the game alone is pretty boring. That's tough because I feel a game like this should be fun with or without a group of people, because sometimes it's out of your control whether or not you get enough people together. If the game that I paid my hard-earned money for doesn't account for stuff like that, then it loses some value to me. If you can get some people together though, it's quite a fun time.
8 out of 10!
The last time I played LEGO Worlds before this review was when it was still in early access. It was a very bare game back then. It only had the world generation and some NPCs walking around. If I remember correctly, the build tool was there too, but only in a very basic form. Back then I thought it was a cool idea. An interesting direction to take a LEGO game for sure, but as a standalone game it lacked a lot of structure. The pieces were still being built, and the main problem I found was that there was a lack of incentive to do much of anything. At the time I was deep into Minecraft, so I didn't need another sandbox building game. Instead, I just ran around the cool looking biomes until I got bored. After playing it again recently, I'm glad to say that LEGO Worlds has shaped up pretty well. First off, there's an actual gameplay loop. NPCs can give you a range of quests for varying rewards, which incentivized me to use the tools at my disposal, and actually pay attention to what was around me. There's an adventure mode, which is meant to be a tutorial of sorts that did a good job of helping me understand how everything worked. Then I felt more equipped to tackle sandbox mode and get to building. There are other things that LEGO Worlds got right off the bat. The world generation here is very cool. I'm not sure how they did it, but the landscape is made entirely of bricks. Those bricks will change from blocks to slopes to whatever else to reflect the terrain, and they're able to adapt on the fly as you edit terrain, which is super cool. The game just looks good overall. Being a procedurally generated sandbox, it would be a hard ask to get a truly next-gen looking LEGO game, but LEGO Worlds manages to look better than most. I still have a few issues with it though. For one, I'm not sure how much staying power this game will have. Only time will tell, but the systems in place to keep people playing will probably diminish in their returns, and mileage may be a problem because of that. Second, and the biggest problem I have, is that editing this game feels really finicky. This is a problem LEGO has had since the digital designer days. Building LEGO in a virtual environment is really tough. LEGO Worlds does the best it can, but it's hard to accurately place bricks in a 3D space when it is ultimately shown on a 2D screen. LEGO building can get really specific too, which only exacerbates the problem. All in all though, I'm happy to see LEGO Worlds end up the way it did. It may not be the game to end all LEGO games, but it's a very cool showcase of what the brand can do. I had a good time with it so far, and I'll have to come back again to see if it still holds up. For now though, I'm feeling pretty solid on this one.
7 out of 10!
Letter Quest Grimm's Journey is a fun little spelling game. Not much more to say really. If you or your kid wants to try a gamified way to expand your vocabulary, it might be a fun time. It's got a nice cartoon art style and some good music, but it's also just a good game to put on while something else is playing. It's all turn-based, so there's no pressure to stay 100% engaged all of the time, even in story mode. I've played it a couple times and had some fun for an hour or two, and that's about it. A fun time killer that makes me feel smart. Not gonna hold my attention for too long, and it's not blowing my mind with any of its mechanics, but really, with a game like this, who cares?
6 out of 10!
Life is Strange is a weird one to talk about. I feel like I'm reviewing a TV show rather than a game. I like talking about mechanics, music, and art. Story is not really my forte when it comes to criticism, so I'm not sure how much I'm gonna have to say. There isn't much game to Life is Strange, but what's there is all centered around the plot. Most games of this type follow the Walking Dead route of limiting the time you have to make decisions, but Life is Strange lets you take all the time you need to ruminate on them, even allowing you to rewind if you don't like some of the answers. Sometimes I feel like this works, and other times I don't. I remember spending at least 10 minutes on the final decision of the game, just sitting in my chair. For those big decisions, I think it can really work. I found myself having a dialogue with myself and others about what to do. Credit to the writing in that aspect for doing such a great job in building those moments. Other times I think it's a bit anticlimactic to let the player rewind if they don't like the decision they made. Eventually you have to pick something, but in a way it ruins some of the suspense and replay value. Aesthetically, I think Life is Strange mostly works. The main problem this game has is its animation and some effects. The game is stuck in a pretty tough spot on this part, because it's really hard to deliver on realistic facial animation, but it's the crux of a lot of things for a game like this. The animators do a decent job of selling emotion through the characters, but the lip syncing isn't as great, which can be distracting. The other main criticism that everyone has levied against Life is Strange is its writing, specifically the character dialogue. It can often feel out of touch with the copious amounts of young people lingo that only ages worse as years go on. Personally, I found it to land a little flat, but in a weird way I kind of appreciated it because of how heavy Life is Strange can get. From a pure gameplay standpoint, Life is Strange is not special or even that great, but it's so obviously not the point that it didn't largely affect my opinion on things. The story took me on a wild ride. Most video game stories just aren't very good, to be frank, but Life is Strange stands out by taking that weak point and making it a strength. Because of that, the game made a real impact on me. I wish I had the writing know-how to elaborate on why, but it was an experience I won't soon forget.
8 out of 10!
Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zero serves as the prologue to the Phantom Pain. Seeing as I've already reviewed the Phantom Pain, I won't say too much here. The gameplay and aesthetics are the same, given a negligible difference here or there. The main difference is the setting and story. The gameplay of Ground Zeroes all takes place in one facility called Camp Omega. Despite the game only taking place in one area, Camp Omega is actually pretty intricate. When you walk around, you'll have to be on your toes the whole time, as there are always guards patrolling and cars driving by. It feels like taking a level from a more traditional Metal Gear and testing how far they can take those systems and layouts. The camp is host to a bunch of missions to make the most of the space. While the main story only takes up one mission, there are a bunch of other fun side missions like hunting down specific soldiers or tributes to past games. But some of this stuff does feel like padding. After the main story mission, I don't think there's much of a reason to stick around, but the game tries to keep people interested by drip feeding tapes with extra lore bits. Even with the side missions in mind, the game is not very long. As cool as it is, revisiting Camp Omega over and over can get a little tiring. Try as they might, Kojima couldn't fully remedy the lack of content in Ground Zeroes. The gameplay that is there is still the same amazing stuff from the Phantom Pain, but the lack of substantial stuff to do makes it hard to recommend at full price. If you can get it on sale, it'll be a nice little experience. You'll get the same story and some fun fan service, but don't expect any more than that.
6 out of 10!
Have you ever taken a look at those subway maps dotted around major cities? Most people might look at them once or twice to learn their route to work or downtown, but the developers of Mini Metro saw an opportunity there. An opportunity that turned into an engaging puzzle game with heavy minimalist aesthetics, breaking down a complicated real-world system to its bare necessities and asking the player to manage an ever-growing population. There's something really satisfying about drawing a line from stop to stop and watching your car pick up passengers. Then one by one, Mini Metro adds more stops and lines until before you know it, you have a complicated web of lines, stops, cars, and people all looking to go somewhere. Add in the adaptive minimalist soundtrack and we've just found one of the most meditative games in my entire library. It's also really cool how the levels are each based off of different real-world locations. Adapting their geography into the game, you can get a sense for how the challenges of the area affected the real-world layouts. Of course, the maps are always very loose adaptations, but I just like the real-world anchor that reminds me that I'm not just playing with crayons. There's not much more I have to say about Mini Metro. It's a very simple game, and for me that absolutely worked in its favor. At the same time, it's another one of those games that you only need a brief look at before you can reasonably determine whether or not it's for you. If the clean visuals, tones, and management gameplay don't look like your thing, then it's probably cool to pass. Sometimes I had to take breaks and play something else just because of how sterile and repetitive it can be. If this game catches you in the right headspace though, you're in for a real treat.
7 out of 10!
Mirror's Edge is a game that works more in theory than in practice. I really like the idea of a parkour game, and in first person you can really get drawn into the action. However, the game feels really rough around the edges in some areas, most disappointingly the mechanics. Let's start with an easy one. I don't think there should be any gunplay in this game. It contradicts what this whole parkour thing is about. Most of the time you're using your parkour skills to avoid confrontation, so why would I start shooting anyone? If guns are fair game, then why not bring one to missions in the first place? It doesn't help that the gunplay itself is incredibly awkward like most things in this game. Usually I'd say it's nice to have the option, but it feels so counterintuitive to everything else that I'd rather it be fully omitted in favor of more defensive options. Secondly, while I was excited for the parkour gameplay, when I actually got into the game, I found it to be incredibly clunky. It's hard to explain, but everything just felt a little weird. All of this platforming and vaulting and whatnot should be about flow, but I never really felt like my actions smoothly connected to each other. It made everything feel really jittery and unsatisfying. It doesn't help that the game's own flow system only really works when you're running in a straight line. If you even think about checking your surroundings or accidentally graze an object, your momentum is ripped from you. Then it snowballs because you usually only get 1 or 2 straight shots to build momentum before the map starts throwing obstacles at you. And finally, the story is really boring. I lost interest as soon as I saw the first animated cutscene. I hate to be too harsh, but the only word I can think of for these cutscenes is ugly. Compared to the gameplay, they're visually jarring, poorly animated, and on top of all that, the story is just not that interesting. Mirror's Edge is carried by its concept. It's an amazing concept for a game, but I don't think it lives up to that idea on the whole. Sometimes you can get a sliver of exhilarating parkour gameplay, but it just makes the rest of the game feel like even more of a letdown in comparison. If you can find some enjoyment out of it, then cool, but I'm not going to stick around to learn all the tricks. It's just not worth my time.
4 out of 10!
The main thing I can respect about Mushroom 11 is that I've never seen another game like it. It's a very unique idea for a game, and that's what originally enticed me to get it. Hopping in, I was optimistic, but not long after I began to dread playing the rest. See, Mushroom 11 is an interesting and original idea for a game, but in practice I found it to be rather frustrating. The biggest issue the game has is control. You have to shave off edges of the mushroom in order to let it grow in new directions and proceed forward. The problem is that you can't control which way the mushroom grows, only which parts you want to erase. This adds a randomness factor that makes the entire game very frustrating to me. Mushroom 11 will ask you to do some pretty precise tasks too. There were lots of times where I'd just sit there erasing single squares over and over, or frantically waving my mouse around praying the damn thing would go where I wanted it. This isn't just a little hiccup here or there. This is the entirety of Mushroom 11. Whether you're trying to push several buttons at once, or grappling between platforms, or running up a boss's leg, the game's challenge comes from the lack of control in its movement, and when something that fundamental is made random, that's when it goes from exciting to frustrating. There's no escaping this control issue, and as such I had very little positive things to hang on to here. But there were some positives. For one, the game looks amazing, the art is very detailed and vibrant from the foreground to the backgrounds. The music is also very good. The sci-fi grooves helped me keep somewhat of a head while playing. I also liked that there was a bit of a story going on, an interesting little post-apocalypse world and plot to follow. That's kind of it though. I'm glad I got through this game for the sake of my list, but I don't think I'll be coming back to this one. Not even a little bit. Again, I can respect the attempt at a unique concept, but I don't think it made the experience any better.
3 out of 10!
Weirdly enough, it took me a minute to find an indie Zelda game. We've got a few of them these days, but the first one I found was Oceanhorn Monster of Uncharted Seas. This game is unabashedly Zelda. You can tell by looking at it. The HUD and items look like Zelda, the main character looks like they're from Zelda, there are dungeons like Zelda, Zelda. Even though everything is rendered in 3D, allowing the use of different camera angles and such, the gameplay is as if you're playing a 2D adventure. This approach caught my attention at the time. As someone who had only played the 3D Zeldas up to that point, I thought it would be a nice bridge point. Because Oceanhorn wears its influences so proudly on its sleeve, I don't have to waste too much time telling you how it plays or how it's structured. MacGuffins to collect, dungeons to solve, a secret society of fish people, you get the gist. What Oceanhorn brings to the table in original content is the visuals, music, and storytelling. And those aren't that great, being honest. The best one is probably the visuals. The story was forgettable and I didn't really like the music. Even though the gameplay is the same as Zelda on paper, I feel like Oceanhorn isn't as satisfying. The game also isn't nearly as polished, not even compared to its indie peers. Animations are stiff, there are lots of little collision quirks and a couple bad bugs I ran into towards the end, and when you look up guides and realize that this was originally a mobile game, Now it makes sense. Oceanhorn has taken all the building blocks of Zelda, some of the things that make those games fun, and a lot that make you go, oh, this is Zelda, but it's not Zelda. Zelda is better than this. Those games have way more attention to detail, little things you don't even notice until it's taken away. And sure, maybe it's not fair to compare Oceanhorn to Zelda, even though the game is advertising it. But even compared to other games of the same price, Oceanhorn still lacks a lot of polish that brings the experience together. So at the end of the day, I didn't feel Oceanhorn justified itself.
4 out of 10!
Alright, so reviewing OneShot right now is a little strange because I technically have beaten the game and I haven't at the same time. On my first playthrough, I went through like normal and had a great time. I loved getting to guide Nico through this desolate alien world, solving puzzles and meeting a wonderful cast of characters. The art in this game is so cute, it makes for a great juxtaposition for how unsettling the plot actually is. This is a very self-aware game. The software, the code that runs this game is its own character, and it has no problem talking to you from the very beginning. It creates a player-game dialogue so upfront it was shocking. This game is just so hard to talk about because it doesn't fit into the traditional lines of game design or narrative. It intentionally blurs those boundaries in order to draw you in, which it does a great job of doing, but it also makes it hard to determine what is fair criticism and what isn't. When it comes to what you spend the most time on, it can feel pretty boring. It is just walking around and talking to people for the majority of the time. You're solving pretty basic puzzles until the next major event happens. But along the way, OneShot will constantly be throwing curveballs at you, and that's what elevates the game from a cute RPG to a once-in-a-lifetime gaming experience. At some points, this also became the game's downfall. At points, I was expecting more crazy shenanigans to happen, but felt let down by a missed opportunity. I said earlier that I beat the game and didn't at the same time. That's because I accomplished the main task, but when I came back to do some side stuff that I missed, the game was completely different. In fact, no, this is where the game truly begins. The fourth wall is Thanos snapped out of existence as all hell breaks loose, and it got to be a little much. OneShot is not for everyone. It's an amazing game, but it doesn't follow the rules. Personally, I think that's kind of refreshing, but it can certainly put off some people. If you're at all interested, I'd say go for it. Play it now before you spoil yourself. But if you're looking for something less pointed, I'd try something else first.
9 out of 10!
Here it is, the game that sold me on Metroidvanias, the game that helped me discover what would become one of my favorite genres. And can you blame me? Ori and the Blind Forest is just a wonderful game. If you're like me, all you need is a glance at this game in motion to be convinced. But while I have the time, let's dive a little deeper. Ori and the Blind Forest starts off with a little story sequence. A very nice and cozy cutscene capped off with an emotional gut punch. As sad as the intro sequence is, I don't feel it was without purpose. It was done to really put you into Ori's shoes. Ori is a lost child. Their journey doesn't start by their own volition. Instead, they're thrust out into the world and forced to grow. It's a really effective way to keep the player moving and tie the progression systems into the narrative. So while the intro was still heart-wrenching, at least it was effective storytelling. That brings us to the main game, which is also remarkably well done. The map design is full of interesting puzzles. The movement is pretty much perfect if you ask me. Super responsive, and the further you get, the more fun abilities you unlock, and it's just a joy to control all the way through. Obviously, the visuals and sounds are some of the best I've seen in a video game. I won't even begin to speculate how long it took the team to create all this artwork. It must have been a pain in the ass, but I think it more than paid off. To go along with this, the soundtrack sells the emotions of whichever scene you're in. Wonderfully orchestrated, and while they don't all stick with me, they do their job and then some. I've only got a couple problems with Ori, and unfortunately they kind of compound on each other. First, the combat isn't very fun or engaging. For how fluid and expressive the movement is, the combat by comparison is a bit of a letdown. Second, Ori has quite a big map, and the progression will have you zigzagging back and forth through a couple main areas. This makes trekking back and forth through previously visited areas kind of mind-numbing, and when you add the combat, I'm just beelining to the next area while spamming the X button. The Definitive Edition has fast travel, which can help, but my playthrough was on the Standard Edition, which sorely lacked that feature. But hey, I can't stay too mad at Ori and the Blind Forest. The game is too gorgeous and too much fun to move around in to say that this was anything other than a great game. There's not a lot of games these days that pull off such amazing aesthetics and tight gameplay, and while I think it has some structural problems, at least in the Standard Edition, it's still worth a play for anyone interested in a 2D adventure.
8 out of 10!
So, Ori and the Will of the Wisps is another Ori adventure. I think that should be the main takeaway here. If you liked Ori and the Blind Forest, you're bound to like Will of the Wisps. At least I felt that way, because the sequel seemed to dig down deeper into parts of the first game I enjoyed so much. The visuals and sounds are as great as ever. It makes sense with the original being such a success that the art would remain top notch, and so would the music. Somehow it manages to look even better than the original. Not by much, mind you. Ori and the Blind Forest is already such a breathtaking game that there wasn't much room for improvement, but they happened to find some, specifically with the better cohesion between the 2D and 3D elements. Will of the Wisps also manages to take care of the combat issues I had with the first game. Before, you usually just spam the attack button mindlessly until foes died, but now you have multiple weapons, all of which feel great and add some more punch and expression to combat. The movement is also just as great, maybe even a little better with even more options than before. This paves the way for big boss fights which take advantage of the spectacle and mechanics that Will of the Wisps offers. Somehow they had to get Ori in a new setting to necessitate a new map, and this is where the game lost me a bit. As fun as the exploration and movement was, I didn't feel as connected to the game's world on the whole. The first game already showed that Ori is capable of a lot, and I was unsure of where the character's arc could go afterwards because of that. The developers were stuck in a tough spot on this one, and unfortunately the story didn't work as well for me. I don't feel like the story of Will of the Wisps was as engaging or blended as well with the gameplay, so my impetus for exploring was more about game mechanics over atmosphere. Ori and the Blind Forest felt a little more balanced in these departments. Will of the Wisps was more about pure gameplay expression for me. Ori and the Will of the Wisps is still a great time, and while the story and setting didn't impact me as much as the first game did, the improvements to gameplay still make it as good as the original, just for different reasons.
8 out of 10!
Okay, so I've got to say that based on my previous reviews, Owlboy shouldn't be as highly rated as I have it right now. Generally, what I like is what I call a balanced game experience. Basically a game that uses all of the medium's tools to the best of their ability, making a game that is both aesthetically and mechanically rich. A game that blends these aspects together into a final product. Owlboy is admittedly a lopsided experience. I'm sure you can tell already that the game's main draw is its visuals. The gameplay isn't as interesting, but I don't care. This is one of the most gorgeous games I've ever played. No, it's not super realistic with dynamic lighting or anything like that. That's not what I mean. A game doesn't have to be realistic to look pretty, and Owlboy is a showcase of that. This game is just chock full of beautiful and painstakingly detailed pixel art. The entire journey is a treat for the eyes, and I'm just eating this up the whole time. I found a lot of my motivation to keep going was primarily to see more of the art. That's not to say any of the other stuff is bad, it just doesn't match the level of the art, which is understandable. Talking about the gameplay, I found it to be much easier than most other games I was playing around the time. I get this sense that the devs were trying their hardest to challenge the player, but they never quite reached the level of difficulty that I come to expect from a game like this. The reason? Well, Otis can fly. Our main character can't really be too challenged because he can just go where he pleases. Giving your player character flight is a really dangerous move because it can break a game's challenge. And unfortunately, as hard as the team tried, I don't think they were able to fully compensate for this ability. I don't think I ever saw a death screen in this game. While Owlboy failed to really challenge me with its gameplay, I actually wasn't too bothered in the end. Being able to breeze through allowed me to smoothly progress. I got to see more of the art, hear more of the music, and witness the entire story without much trouble. Maybe it was intentional then, that the game's weak points guided you into its strengths. Or maybe it was a coincidence. Either way, Owlboy ended up being a wonderful experience even with its flaws. Its gameplay isn't going to rock the boat as much as its visuals will, even though they are still perfectly enjoyable. When I play Owlboy, I play it for its mind-blowing presentation. Its visuals, of course, but even its music is fantastic and the story is pretty fun too. It's a whimsical game in a lot of aspects. So if that sounds or looks like fun to you, please show this game some love.
8 out of 10!
Pacify is good for a one-time scare, and that's it. This is kind of textbook for these cheap horror games. It's only worked on to the point where it can get a good scare out of you, and so that it's presentable in some fashion. In practice, Pacify ended up being confusing more than anything else. The game doesn't do a great job of explaining what's going on, and so my friends and I were always forced to look up what we were supposed to be doing. To be completely honest, we did not play much more than an hour of this game, but that was still way longer than it was actually entertaining for. Creepy-looking teleporting AI monsters are scary, but only until they get in the way of your objective. Then they become a nuisance. In Pacify, that happened pretty quickly after we found our objective. Even for those who want a cheap horror experience, I wouldn't recommend this game. There's plenty of free games that will do the same thing, and if you're looking for multiplayer, you deserve more content than this game provides. So don't bother.
3 out of 10!
I thought I was really into Payday 2 when I first scored this game. I remember it being a lot of fun. Of course, I only ever played with friends. With the amount of communication, teamwork, and planning some of Payday 2's missions take, I never felt like playing with randoms was a good idea. Either way, the gunplay was fun, the different stages of missions were cool, like how you could scout an area out before putting your mask on. It felt really cool and unique to have that amount of control over the situation. But looking at the stats, things don't look as good. Apparently, I didn't spend nearly as much time in the game as I thought I did. It was always hard to get a full squad for this game, so I didn't expect too much, but even with that in mind, I was shocked. This led me to think about what I must have spent my time on if I remember it so fondly. Turns out I was really picky with the missions I wanted to play. My favorite missions by far were the ones that required some element of stealth. There was one in particular where you had to rob a car dealership, and we spent a good amount of time on that one alone. My friends and I tried to go as long as we could without having to start shooting, and that forced us to look for patterns and openings and communicate on what we saw to each other. That was such a cool feeling, but as soon as the guns came out, I lost interest. At that point, Payday 2 just became a basic co-op shooter to me, and that wasn't nearly as interesting as trying to stay passive. This is why I was so picky. Any mission that didn't give you an opportunity to be stealthy, I wasn't interested in. And I really enjoyed the missions where I could, but this approach resulted in me skipping most of the game's missions. In any other case, I'd rather play something like Left 4 Dead or CSGO, which were much more enjoyable shooting experiences in my opinion. So based on my experience, I'm feeling split down the middle here. I genuinely had a lot of fun with Payday 2, but only because I refused to play most of it. I don't have the urge to go back to it either. I haven't for a long time.
5 out of 10.
Piku Niku was certainly an interesting purchase on my end. It's a very quirky game, with snarky writing and the loose sense of everything else. It's one of those games where what you see is what you get. So painfully so that when I bought the game hoping there would be more, I felt like the joke was on me. Did I really watch the trailer for this game and expect anything else? Yeah, I guess I did. At least it's a short game. I was starting to get tired of it, but decided to push through one last time, and lo and behold, it was over. It didn't really impact me one way or the other. It was just a thing that I played. I think Piku Niku wants to be a satire, but unfortunately, I don't think it stuck the landing. There's a lot of video game tropes present in here. Unnecessary collectibles? Check. Random minigames? Check. A repetitive soundtrack? Check. There's a lot more, and while it could have worked, I felt that as is, Piku Niku just became what it was critiquing. It just ended up being a stereotypical video game. In this instance, it wasn't very interesting. There wasn't much wrong with it, but it didn't have much going for it either. It's a shame because I think something like this could have really worked. Given another go, this could have been a hit, but it felt a little half-baked. Maybe that's another point of satire, who knows.
5 out of 10.
Of all the Valve IPs, Portal has to be my favorite. I love pretty much everything about it, from its base concepts to the little Easter eggs. Its signature portal gun gameplay has got to be one of my favorite puzzle mechanics in all of video games. Of course, you can't forget this game's presentation, including the character GLaDOS, who has since become an iconic gaming character. The pacing of this game is also pretty great. The game will ease you into the concepts one by one until the end where I was a portal shooting master before I even knew it. But it's not just the pacing of the puzzles, it's also the story. GLaDOS is incredibly well written from beginning to end. You know she's always watching you in the test chamber, but she'll only chime in with important information or if she wants to insult you. She doesn't start getting crazy talkative until the last major section of the game, wherein you've already learned most of the concepts you need to progress. On top of all that, her lines are a perfect mix of dry humor, important information, and intimidation. Through all of that, I felt like I knew GLaDOS way before the ending where we actually got to see her. Even though I've already played this game a dozen times, I still have fun every time I start a new game. Shooting and jumping through portals is satisfying enough that I don't care if I already know how to solve the puzzles. Its shorter length also helps its replayability and pacing. Because Portal doesn't lollygag, it doesn't meander to give you story scenes or funny gags, it lets you go through the game as fast or as slow as you want without missing too much or feeling like a slog. Portal is a really tight experience. Its gameplay is satisfying to learn and get creative with, the progression feels really natural, and its story is incredibly well written while staying pretty unintrusive. Yes, it is on the shorter side, but I still find every puzzle and Easter egg and companion cube fun to mess around with no matter how often I come back.
Oh my god, it's a 10 out of 10!
Right away, I want to say that Portal 2 is a fantastic game. The Portal duology has proven to be one of the most consistently great series in the entire industry. I loved the first game, I have a lot of memories with it. It has great pacing, fun puzzles, and an understated but really effective plot. I had a great time with Portal 2 as well, but originally I had it a notch lower than the first game. After some vehement backlash from a friend or two, I decided to play it one more time before review. During any playthrough of Portal 2, I always have a great time without fail. The first thing that always hits me is the upgraded presentation. The opening sequence where Wheatley tries to get you out of the test chamber dorms is still impressive to me, and that's only the beginning. The game is full of cool little details and atmospheric lighting and cool sound effects. It really is a joy to experience from beginning to end. Obviously, the portal hopping gameplay is back and it's just as good as before. There's a lot more maps to play in and many more ideas explored than in the first game. The game doesn't spend as much time harping on concepts from the first game, and as someone who is already familiar with Portal 1, I felt it kept things fresh. Although I realize this may not be very kind to newcomers. Portal 2's gameplay is really fun, but there were some things I wanted to note. As cool as it was to explore the depths of aperture science, I felt a lot of these in-between sections boiled down to find the white paint, which wasn't very satisfying. Some of it is great. In fact, one of my favorite puzzles is in a place like this, but other times I'm just thinking, where's the fun in that? Why not just put a walkway down at this point? Secondly, I wasn't a huge fan of the gel puzzles. The way the gel spreads is slightly random and can feel kind of finicky. I remember having a lot of trouble with these in earlier playthroughs because I was never sure if I was doing it right. For the sake of brevity, I want to get straight to the source of my Portal vs. Portal 2 conundrum. These are both fantastic games, but personally, I still think Portal 1 is my go-to. Portal 1 has more of a nostalgic connection to me, yes, but Portal 1 is also a lot more approachable than 2 in my opinion. It's shorter and more consistent. Portal 2 is also fantastic, but it feels like more of an endeavor. It hits heights greater than the first game, but also snags just below in some spots. I never had any complaints with Portal 1 other than its length, but I do have some stuff to say about Portal 2. Even though the score is what it is, you know which one I prefer on a given day.
Oh my god, it's a 10 out of 10!
I really just don't care about Portal stories, Mel. That's not to diss the people who worked on this game, it just didn't stick with me one bit. Somehow I spent a good few hours in this game and I don't remember one thing except maybe the first room. It's cool to have a fan game on the Steam store page. Valve has generally been pretty cool with their fans in this aspect, but even though I know and love the main 2 Portal games, this one just didn't capture the same magic. It's hard to remember if I even liked it or not, so we're just gonna put it at a
5 out of 10.
Even though it's easy to compare Rivals of Aether to Smash Bros, it really is its own beast. It's still a platform fighter, but one with its own approach to mechanics, stages, and more. These little things take a game that looks like a knockoff Smash at first glance, and turns it into a fun game in its own way. Let's start with the mechanics. Rivals of Aether has a bunch of interesting mechanics to its name. The biggest one for me to adjust to is that there's no shielding in this game. Instead, there's a parry mechanic, which can stun foes for a counterattack if timed correctly. This alone makes Rivals an incredibly aggressive game, coupled with the fact that there are no ledges to hang on to, which means no ways to get invincibility outside of respawning. Rivals is all about the fight. Character-specific mechanics come in to suit your playstyle, but even the more passive ones will have you running in every once in a while. The stages in Rivals are also much more understated. The game has more of a focus on fair competitive play, so you won't find any crazy stage hazards. For me, this is give or take. While I've said many times that I prefer competitive play in my platform fighters, I don't mind wacky stages for fun. I still have a good amount of fun from the combat interactions in Rivals, so it isn't a huge deal. But if you still think this is a Smash clone, then let me tell you that in addition to no wacky stages, there are also no items. Period. It's all about characters in this game, which I kinda like because it allows the devs to get more experimental with them. The presentation of Rivals of Aether has me a little mixed. I generally like the pixelated art style, the character portraits, the menus and stages all look pretty nice, but I found myself getting lost in combat more than a few times. In addition to how fast Rivals is, I feel like some of the character sprites can be hard to read. Because it's all pixel art, there's limited information that can be displayed in a single pose. And the smaller and more nimble the character gets, the bigger this problem becomes. But all in all, Rivals of Aether has been a great time. I also forgot to mention the workshop, which has quickly become my favorite way to play the game. If you are looking into Rivals of Aether, I might recommend it on the workshop alone. It's that much fun. But the game also has fun mechanics and characters, a charming art style, and refreshing gameplay. It certainly stands on its own as a great fighter.
8 out of 10!
I played a decent amount of RoboCraft many years ago with some friends. I remember pretty much only good things, but it's been so long since those sessions I was questioning if it held up or if I just had rose-tinted glasses. So a friend and I hopped in recently and here's what I found. There's two main interactions that make RoboCraft satisfying to me. Building and then playing that build for the first time. The building mechanics in RoboCraft are relatively intuitive. It helps that everything was kept to a grid. Building structures with blocks and then adding attachments for battle is really about as complicated complicated as you're gonna get. I see this as a positive as it keeps things understandable, control simple, and still allowing for a lot of creativity. It's kind of like what I said about Minecraft. The main object in the game is a simple block, but already when you allow the player to build in any direction, you have a ton of room for creativity. This simpler approach already has a ton of possibilities for cool designs, as you can see from the community, which you can download and try for yourself if you want. The second part I like is testing your build. When building, you only get to see your creation in a static state, but taking it out to the field, you get to see how it works in real time. In battle, you can gather information while you play, like how heavy your vehicle is, how fast or slow, or how much firepower you need. This can be taken back into the garage and creates a nice little gameplay loop. As fun as it is, I never really got caught in this loop for too long. Robocraft kind of incentivizes you to optimize your vehicle for battle, but I'm more the type to just want to get creative. On that end, I didn't feel as incentivized, and so eventually I'd get bored and leave. For what it is, Robocraft is pretty fun. There were still people playing last time I checked. It has a clear gameplay loop that can really work for some types of people, and it does a decent job in keeping things accessible. It doesn't really stick with me anymore, and I don't intend on going back in the foreseeable future, but when I did play, I can say I had some amount of fun.
6 out of 10!
I haven't played Rocket League in such a long time, but I still don't care to come back to it. Playing soccer with cars is fun, but it was so repetitive, even back at launch. I don't even know if they've changed much since the last time I played, but I don't care to look. The core gameplay is just not very interesting to me. No amount of fancy new cosmetics is going to change that. I recognize that there's a lot of nuance to Rocket League's mechanics. There's a thriving esports scene that showcases how precise you can be, and while that can be fun, I always had a casual approach to Rocket League. From that point of view, I thought the game was fun, but only in short bursts. The magic of the game faded really quickly, and every time I came back, my sessions were shorter and shorter. It's a fine game, I can see why people may spend so much time on it, but personally, I've lost all interest.
6 out of 10!
Serena is another one of those art/experience focused games. It's all about the atmosphere and the story rather than the mechanics and whatnot. Normally I'd say that's fine, but Serena didn't really connect with me. The game is really short and takes place entirely within a small cabin. You don't get to see the outside. The story itself is also very cryptic, and it seems like you just had to go around this cabin just to kill some time for the ending. This was another game I used a guide for. I'm not the greatest at these point and click puzzle games, but Serena made it even harder because there was no clear progression from one thing to another. I can't imagine someone getting through this game organically and it being fun. You'd be combing the cabin over and over again looking for objects and where they fit. That sounds really tedious. It doesn't help either that Serena's cabin isn't the prettiest thing to look at. It's still a finished game. I didn't run into any bugs or soft locks or anything like that. It's a free game and it's pretty short if you can figure it out. But even still, I'd rather spend 3 hours on a good game than 1 hour on a bad one. Even being free, I wouldn't recommend it unless you're morbidly curious. Spend your time on something better.
3 out of 10!
I've heard so much hype about Shantae throughout the years. Even though I thought Risky's Revenge was a fine game, I guess I was still a little disappointed. I was led to believe that this would be a great series to get sucked into, one with great characters, art, music, and gameplay. I thought those things were fine, but it didn't really hook me in for another take. Risky's Revenge is a solid platformer. I had zero issues with how it controlled or anything like that. I feel like the hair whip could have been a little longer, but that's about it. I liked the look of the game too. Shantae Risky's Revenge has some great pixel art and animation. There were also some cool characters in there. All of this is fun, but the game had some issues that kept me from really admiring it. This may sound like a nitpick to some, but one of the issues that irked me the most was the clashing game and UI elements. The gameplay is all pixel art, but the menus and HUD look like they were taken from a Flash game. The lack of cohesion and consistency in the art style never let me get fully into the game, I feel. Beyond that, the game has some weird progression issues as well. I was expecting Shantae Risky's Revenge to be laid out like a Metroidvania, but it's more like a 2D platforming Zelda game. You have a main hub, different areas to explore, and dungeons to conquer as part of the main quest. When going around the main areas, you have a map at your disposal, which is absolutely terrible at telling you where you are and where to go. This made progression impossible without a guide at some points. Secondly, the dungeons themselves aren't that fun to go through in my opinion. These try to be more like bite-sized Metroidvania maps, but they don't hold the same weight. It usually just ends up being a spaghetti string of rooms until you reach the end. Except for one of the dungeons, which is just a gauntlet against enemies. I felt like Risky's Revenge had the DNA of a really great game. It has some fun power-ups, decent movement and combat, it has cool characters and a nice but uneven art style, but it didn't live up to all the Shantae hype, and it just didn't feel fully thought out. The elements were there, but they never fully came together in the final product.
6 out of 10!
Civ 5 is my favorite strategy game of all time. Actually, that's not saying much because I don't play many strategy games, but Civ 5 is still amazing. I've been playing this game for years and I've never really gotten bored of building my own empire. Whether I'm focusing on trade, religion, combat, or any of the many ways to play the game, I'm always having fun. The progression of any game of Civ is really smooth, and usually hooks me in for hours. It starts off really simple, but then blossoms into a complicated management game towards the end. Even though the end game can be really complicated, I never felt overwhelmed because the game will ease you into it as you make more units and settle more cities. The only real problem I have with Civ 5 is the online. Playing Civ with your friends is really fun, but sometimes it feels impossible to get a game going. This is because the game is really sensitive to desyncs. If someone so much as nudges their router, everyone's screen will freeze as the game tries to catch everyone up. Every time it happens, it ruins the flow of the game, and if it gets really bad, it becomes unplayable. Given that this is a turn-based game, I wouldn't expect this to be too much of an issue, but it is. The couple times I have gotten a multiplayer game going though, it was a lot of fun. Other than that, I don't really have any major complaints with Civ 5. I have fun every time I start a new game. You've got lots of civs to choose from, all with different playstyles. There's a practically infinite number of maps. You can even mod the game through the workshop to add custom civs, although I usually stick with the main game. Even still, this game has so much to offer, it feels like Civilization 5 is an endless chest of gameplay. Gameplay that has kept me coming back for hours on end, and probably many more.
9 out of 10!
I played a ton of this game as a kid. Sid Meier's Pirates is an incredibly fun pirate sim game where you get to sail the Caribbean, take down ships, make alliances, and search for treasures. It has a couple issues, and unfortunately it can be hard to play thanks to the passage of time. Still, because of how much fun I consistently have pretending to be a pirate, I don't mind the quirks of an old game too much. Sid Meier is more known for his Civilization series where you build empires and command units in turn-based strategy. Pirates, on the other hand, is more of a management game. Things can move pretty fast in this game, so standing around doing nothing is not a great option. Luckily though, there are a lot of things you can do to fill that time. The first thing I would always do is hunt down the top 10 most wanted pirates. It's cool to see digital versions of real-world pirates from around the same time the game takes place, including people like Henry Morgan, Captain Kidd, and of course Blackbeard. Of course, there are many other things as well, like taking on missions to gain favor with the nations and people in the area, or uncovering buried treasure. The only task I wasn't fond of, unfortunately, was the main quest of finding your lost relatives. I usually skipped this one when I played, but recently I decided to finish it and found it really disappointing compared to the rest of the game. It's very repetitive and it doesn't feel very satisfying when you find everyone. It's similar to the main problem I have with the game as a whole. There doesn't seem to be a clear end goal. Fully completing any task on the mission log doesn't actually net you anything besides fame. The game just keeps going until you retire or your character dies of old age. Because of this, I can't say I've ever finished a full game of Sid Meier's Pirates. It just takes too long. But I still really enjoy all the systems at play here. Even though there's not really a clear end goal in sight, I still find it intrinsically enjoyable to sail around in battleships, follow quests, or just get the lowdown from the local bartender. All of that stuff is really fun to me, and because of that, I still love this game. It's getting a bit old, and if you don't have a numpad on your keyboard, which I don't blame you if you don't, it can be pretty hard to play, but luckily for me, I can still play just fine. As long as I can still play it, I'm still going to have fun with Sid Meier's Pirates.
9 out of 10!
Simple Planes is a surprisingly fun little flight sim. You get to build your own plane and fly around an island doing a bunch of different missions. There's also an edutainment angle, where the game will explain to you the pieces you need and the physics you need to know in order to understand how to make and fly an aircraft. Is it completely accurate? I have no idea, but it's close enough that I can see a kid playing this game and eventually getting into aviation or engineering. Simple Planes isn't really my cup of tea. On the edutainment scale, I think it's more education than entertainment, and I'm not playing these games to learn about planes, so it didn't blow me away. Still, I was pleasantly surprised.
6 out of 10!
MOBAs tend to get a bad rap from the general gaming community, or maybe it's just the circle I'm in, but the genre is generally known to me and my friends as the home for toxicity. I have always tended to avoid the likes of League of Legends and Dota 2 because of this. The footage I did see usually didn't help either, with the amount of different characters and moves and just general frantic chaos that made it hard to understand anything. Still, eventually a friend of mine got sucked in through Smite. Of all the MOBA games to choose, I must say that Smite looked the most approachable. The camera was down closer to the action, making it feel more like a third-person over-the-shoulder game. All the characters were gods from different mythologies, which I have a passing interest in, so eventually I joined him for a few games and I had a pretty decent time. I was absolutely terrible at the game, but I still had fun seeing famous mythological characters wail on each other. The game controlled well, and when I actually got into the matches, all the menus and HUD elements that looked intimidating before weren't as much. It definitely helped that I had someone there to explain to me what was going on, because things can still get a little chaotic. The maps can get pretty big, and I tended to hyper-focus on my own lane and lose track of what my team was doing. The main gameplay problem I had with Smite was that it can be hard to make out big fights very well. There will be projectiles and swords and ults flying all over the place and numbers ticking up and down, and it's just a lot all at once. There's a lot of visual stuff going on, and for some reason characters don't really react when they're getting hit, so I lose track of my health until I'm in the red and it's already too late. That's basically the bread and butter of Smite, and even though I enjoy most everything else, that's usually why I choose not to play it very much anymore, especially not by myself.
7 out of 10!
Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed is a mouthful of a title, and it might also be my favorite racing game. Of course, the game has some of my favorite characters in the whole industry, but it also has super smooth controls, fun mechanics, and amazing track design. The game also still looks and sounds pretty good on PC. Transformed is a bit of a Mario Kart clone on paper, but in practice the two play pretty differently. The easiest example I can give is the item play. Mario Kart has a much higher focus on items. They affect the race a lot more than in Racing Transformed. In this game, more attention is given to the feel of driving and the spectacle of the tracks. I don't hate the items in Mario Kart, but my enjoyment of those games was much more derived from the driving mechanics, and so having that be more of a focus in here makes the game more enjoyable to me. The tracks are also much more dynamic than a typical Mario Kart course. There was a lot of emphasis on courses that change in the middle of a race to show off the coolest part of Racing Transformed, the transforming. By racing through specific points in a track, your car might transform into either a plane or a boat, and this allows for some really crazy courses. In one lap you might be in a car and then all of a sudden the road explodes and you need to take to the skies. Stuff like that is all over this game. There's another comparison point to Mario here, and I want to make sure this is pointed out. Transforming vehicles in this game is not anything like gliding or going underwater in Mario Kart. Gliding, for example, happens off a ramp, and you can't really control what happens while you're in the air. Going underwater is more of a change of scenery than anything else. In Racing Transformed, you get full control over the aircraft. Driving the boat is like playing one of those arcade boat racing games. In both cases, these changes in setting feel similar to driving, but Sonic and All-Stars Racing Transformed takes greater advantage with effects, control, and allowing new layouts. Because of all that, the game has snuck its way into becoming my favorite racing game at the moment. It looks and sounds great, it features characters I love, and it showcases a lot of creativity with its mechanics and gimmicks.
9 out of 10!
Sonic and Sega All-Stars Racing is a fun time, but I wouldn't recommend playing it with friends. That's kind of a death sentence to a game like this, but luckily I can enjoy kart racers with or without other people. It's fun to see another spin on the genre, and one that feels really nice to play. It's got fun characters and some decent tracks, but it's let down by really unbalanced mechanics. There's two main issues at play when it comes to the mechanics. First, some characters are way too overpowered. Shadow in particular takes much less time to charge a boost than any other character, which allows him to almost constantly be boosting into first place and beyond. Second, when you get into first place, there isn't much there to stop you. If you fire homing missiles backwards, they'll home onto the person in second place. If you get enough items like this, you can just keep stomping your competition down for the whole race, and there's not much other people can do about it. There's a few all-star moves that can hinder your lead, but that's if those characters are in the race at all. Even though the game's balance is pretty much broken, I still enjoy playing this game. It has a lot of charm with its charismatic announcer and wacky characters, not all beholden to karts. The driving does feel really good and the tracks are well designed, even if there are way too many themed after Sonic. It's still a fun alternative to Mario Kart if you're interested.
7 out of 10!
Sonic CD was another fine 2D Sonic platformer. It wasn't my favorite of the classic series, but I came to respect how out there it was in comparison to the rest. It also helped that the pacing when just going from level to level was pretty decent. My major problem with the game was the time travel element. Just going from beginning to end was fine for gameplay, but it wasn't the most satisfying because if you want the best ending, you have to engage with time travel, which I found to be incredibly clunky. To start, it was really difficult for me to get enough speed or distance to change time. Sometimes I'd be going blistering fast, but clip something just before I assume it would activate, which didn't always feel very fair because when you're moving that fast, it's hard to react to obstacles in time. Other times, I'd find a nice long stretch to run along and I'd be going and going, but the trigger just wouldn't activate. The game doesn't really explain the conditions that need to be met for time travel to initiate, but when you start the process, you have no choice but to figure it out or fail trying. Because of all that trouble and the extra stuff you have to do once you actually get to the future or past, I just decided it wasn't worth it. I also wasn't a huge fan of the special stages. They weren't the worst special stages I've played in a Sonic game, but I generally don't like Sonic special stages because of how they lock important MacGuffins behind unrelated gameplay. Other than this stuff, Sonic CD was still a decent stage-to-stage platforming experience. It's got some crazy level design, but when I decided to avoid the time travel stuff, I didn't find it as frustrating anymore. Then I could enjoy the music and art and general momentum gameplay. By playing with those stipulations, I can see Sonic CD being a pretty good time overall.
7 out of 10!
I've got a lot of memories and a lot of hours spent on Sonic Generations. From playing the demo incessantly going for the perfect score, to watching my friend play it live on stream. Sonic Generations is definitely up there as one of my favorite Sonic games, although it ain't a perfect experience. I've replayed this game quite a few times, but over the years it's safe to say I have spent exponentially more time on the modern stages than the classic ones. The modern Sonic stages in Generations never let me down. They offer a variety of things depending on the stage, like complex branching level design to longer marathons to easy entertaining blasts of speed. There's only 9 modern stages in the game, but they're all pretty well done and easily replayable. Planet Wisp is definitely the worst out of the bunch, but I've gotten used to it, so I'll give it a pass. The classic stages aren't bad, they're just not as fine-tuned as the modern ones. Generations was yet another attempt at bringing back classic gameplay, and while it's far from the worst, it still isn't as good as the originals. The momentum is still off and the spin dash is really overpowered for no reason. I also feel like the levels don't achieve the same flow that the modern ones have, but I enjoy the modern stages and gameplay so much that the game still gets a really positive reception from me. The bosses are also pretty great, except for the final boss, but the rival battles are all hits. Whenever I do a run through of this game, I make sure to hit all the rival battles along the way. There's also some great bonuses like the statue room, tons of concept art from the series' history, and a wide selection of music which you can use inside of actual stages. All in all, Sonic Generations is a nice love letter to fans. Even with some hiccups, I didn't even mention the story, which is pretty one note, it's still one of the best Sonic games I've played and certainly one of the better anniversary titles. If you're into Sonic and somehow haven't played this, give it a try. And if you're not, I'd still recommend it if you're interested in seeing what Sonic is about.
9 out of 10!
Sonic 4 Episode 1 is just here. The only real reason this game is still worth talking about is its name. They actually called this Sonic 4. Well, this ain't like any other classic game. It's got some plasticky, sometimes oversaturated visuals, terrible music, and nowhere near the same momentum in its gameplay. Sonic 4 Episode 1 is also really short. It's only got a handful of zones, and that may have been okay back in the day, assuming these stages are the same quality, which they aren't. But in 2010, if you're selling a game called Sonic 4 and trying to make it a big deal, this is not a good start, even if it is episodic. Now, I'm clearly not a fan of Sonic 4, but as the years have gone on, the title has become pretty inoffensive compared to the rest of Sonic's library. It's certainly not a masterpiece, but it's also not a dumpster fire. It just sits there existing. It's perfectly playable. If you really want to, you can squeeze a decent amount of time out of it, but it's just not worth investing anything into, especially with games like Sonic Mania and the classics being readily available. Morbidly curious players will pick it up and most won't hate it, but games worth experiencing will be actively enjoyable. They'll teach or say something or have immense amounts of depth in mechanics or showcase amazing art, etc. But Sonic 4 Episode 1 doesn't do anything other than kill time.
5 out of 10.
Out of the 2 episodes of Sonic 4, Episode 2 is definitely the better one, and the only one that might be worth playing. I would still never call this a high priority game, but Episode 2 at least tries to aim for some quality gameplay and hits a few marks. Right off the bat, this game looks miles better than the first. It's still not mind-blowing, but at least it's not an eyesore, and it can look legitimately pretty at points. There's also some new stuff going on with the gameplay in the form of the new team-up mechanic. Thanks to Tails, you can join forces to do a bunch of new, more powerful moves. They don't end up being being anything game-changing, but it was a nice attempt at a gimmick and it doesn't entirely fall flat. The level design is also much better than episode 1. It can still get pretty railroady, but levels have a greater sense of flow now, which can also be attributed to the slightly better physics. I also like some of the music in episode 2. The soundtrack as a whole is really hit or miss, and when Sonic 2 misses, it misses hard. But some tracks do remind me of what good Sonic music does sound like. Sonic 4 episode 2 still isn't worth most people's time, but I would recommend this any day over episode 1. It feels like there was a much greater attempt at making a good video game, not just another Sonic game. So if you try it, I don't think it'll be terrible.
6 out of 10!
Spyro was the perfect sit-back game to play during the lockdown days. It captured my attention thanks to my love of the mythical creatures and kept me playing all the way through to 100% completion. It wasn't very challenging, but I think that's exactly what I needed back then. Instead, I could just take in the gorgeous visuals and animation and have fun exploring each world for treasure. The structure of Spyro is like a classic collect-a-thon. My immediate go-to comparison is Mario 64, but I guess it's a little more like Banjo-Kazooie? Either way, instead of a castle and levels, you just hop straight from area to area in Spyro once you've saved enough dragons. I like this approach because it keeps the pace up while still providing neat checkpoints if you're getting tired. Spyro isn't a very difficult game at all. Enemies won't give you much trouble, nor will finding most of the collectibles. I felt like only going for 100% completion offered any challenge, and I guess that's a fair approach. You don't want any typical player having too many bad experiences, but when they want to go for more out-of-the-way stuff, then that's an invitation to test their knowledge of the game. I still think Spyro is a little too easy. If you don't go for 100%, it might feel kind of mind-numbing. Luckily, completing the game doesn't take too long. It just adds some extra challenge. There's not much more to say about Spyro the Dragon. It's a pretty simple game. It's on the easier side, the story and bosses aren't very interesting, but the moment-to-moment exploration and levels are fun. I had a great time jumping around torching bad guys and saving all sorts of dragons.
8 out of 10!
Even though I still really enjoyed Spyro 2, I wasn't having as much fun as the first game. It could be because the novelty of the series was wearing off by that point. I was pleasantly surprised by Spyro 1, but now the series had to do more to keep me engaged. In comparison to the first game, I don't think it succeeded, although I still definitely enjoyed the time I had. One of my favorite parts of Spyro 1 was all the dragons you find, but that game already solved that problem. Going into Spyro 2, I was ready to see more of the dragons and their world, but right away we were sucked into a completely different setting. Maybe because of that and because of the level designs themselves, I found collecting to be a bit more checklisty. I wasn't a huge fan of the mission structure either. I would have rather just explored and found collectibles out in the open. It feels more organic that way. The story wasn't great either, but then again neither was the first game. Same with the bosses. I think I just don't understand why everyone loves these characters so much. I thought they were just okay. I still had a good time with Spyro 2, even though I was disappointed by the lack of anything dragons. The setting did allow for a lot of variation in levels. Some were really cool to see and explore. The levels themselves felt a bit more challenging, so collecting wasn't as mind-numbing as the first game could be. Of course, the game is still great to look at, control, and listen to. Seeing as all of these games are coming off the Reignited trilogy, that would be a given. So I think I still have my preference. Who knows, maybe I'll come back and Spyro 2 will hit me differently, but as it is now, I think it's a fun but not amazing game. Still definitely worth playing if you're going through the trilogy.
7 out of 10!
Spyro Year of the Dragon was a really good way to cap off the Reignited trilogy. Spyro 2 had to do some experimenting to find a new formula, and while I think it mostly succeeded, Year of the Dragon felt like a more refined version. The main improvement I felt was the levels. The game felt like more of a mix between the first Spyro, which was almost purely exploratory, and the second one, which had a lot of missions. Year of the Dragon found a great balance that really catered to my tastes in a platformer. Of course, the game still looks and sounds and controls as well as the others, but there are also some new additions in the form of new playable characters. If you recall my Sly Cooper reviews, that series did a similar thing with bringing in new characters to add variation in gameplay. While I wasn't a big fan of that concept in general, I think Spyro handled it better. The purple dragon still does most of the work and gets most of the attention. I think it's a good thing to keep him in the spotlight, and these other characters come in as support. Their sections aren't very long or complex, and so it ends up feeling like a minigame of sorts. That's something I can get down with. Overall, I felt the Spyro Reignited trilogy was an amazing package. It's not for everyone, but what you get is 3 incredibly solid games filled with things to collect, characters to meet, and levels to explore. I played and completed all 3 of these titles in a row and had fun from Spyro 1 to Year of the Dragon. Yes, of course I had my favorites, but at the end of the day, they're all great games. Year of the Dragon felt like a culmination of the trilogy. The level designs were a lot more complex, the challenge felt just right, and it didn't get in its own way very much. Most of it was just exploring, collecting, and helping people out, and I felt like that was the essence of the series in the first place. Great game and a great trilogy.
8 out of 10!
When I first started Starbound, I expected it to be like 2D Minecraft. I picked up the game back when it was brand new and put it down pretty quickly because, well, if I already had Minecraft, why would I need to play this? Honestly, I'm not sure how much has changed since I first played the game. If I was right back then and things have changed, or if I was wrong the whole time and just didn't know it. Now Starbound may look like a basic sandbox with a space theme, but the game is actually more about exploration than it is about building. A more experienced friend and I got together recently to play the game, and I found that Starbound actually puts a lot more behind quests and exploration than the sandbox. The sandbox stuff is still there if you want to use it, but the game encourages you to hop from planet to find things. Because of that, I feel like it was hard to get into building since that requires you to stay in one area for a longer period of time, meaning less spent on a more prominent part of the game. But honestly, my favorite part of Minecraft nowadays is just walking around and seeing what generates. Starbound actually incentivizes that, which I was happy to see. My friend and I only got through what must have been the tutorial before having to log off, but if it's any indication of what Starbound can offer, then I'm in for a good time. My only concern is how the game can keep up this sort of structure. All the random generation makes me think that quests will eventually start to look the same, and even though there is a theoretical endless amount of content, in reality the returns the player gets only go so far. For now though, I'm pretty happy with Starbound. Some things are still a little clunky like the UI and sometimes combat, but all in all I'm pretty excited by the game's prospects. I'm hesitant to give it a super high score because I haven't seen enough of where it's going, but for now I'm still feeling pretty positive.
7 out of 10!
Streets of Rage 4 has become a new obsession of mine. I first got the game because I was interested in playing more Sega titles. This revival of the classic series was coming out around the time, so I bought in. Turns out this game wasn't actually developed by Sega, but licensed out to another team. A team that did a wonderful job. Beat-em-ups aren't really my thing generally speaking. The few I played in arcades seemed pretty simple and just wanted your quarters more than anything else. I also had no prior experience with the Streets of Rage franchise. Needless to say, Streets of Rage 4 was a bit of a gamble, but one that paid off. One of the biggest factors in selling me on this game was the art. Streets of Rage 4 goes for a rough comic book style presentation, and it fits really well in this context. The animations to the posing to the line art and colors make the game really bold and punchy, great for this genre. The soundtrack is also full of electronic tunes that'll get your blood pumping. The combat feels impactful and combos are really satisfying to pull off, especially on bosses. The game also has a decent roster that suits different playstyles, grapplers, air comboers, all-rounders, and the game will also feed you a bunch of classic characters to try out. It's just a shame the game is so short. There are a decent amount of levels in Streets of Rage 4, but the game as a whole is on the shorter side. As a new player, the length felt just right, but as I started to come back to try new characters and whatnot, I felt a little let down by how repetitive things got. From the very first level onwards, you'll be seeing the same enemies with different color swaps. Occasionally a new type is introduced that'll challenge you a little more, but the bulk of the guys you fight will be repeats. It's not like they do anything new either. They might be a little more aggressive, but the only real difference is that they have more health. It can kind of be a drag on the end of the game, when it's all the same fights you've done before, but it just takes longer. But all in all, Streets of Rage 4 has been a great time. The presentation is really well done, the combat is satisfying even if it can get repetitive, and playing with friends is a blast. It can be tough if you're not used to this type of game like I was, but stick with it and you might have a new favorite in your library.
8 out of 10!
Super Hexagon is a really simple game. Guide a little triangle around a hexagon, avoiding the shapes as they reach the center. It's really straight to the point. Even loading up the game is just picking a difficulty and you're immediately in. That's something I can really appreciate about Super Hexagon. It doesn't mess around. The bright colors and loud music might feel a little extra, but I think it becomes a part of the challenge. The music and lights even get more intense the higher the difficulty. I really appreciate Super Hexagon for all that. Every now and then I might boot it up and give it a whirl. Then I can see how far I get and put it back down. There's no fluff, just intense gameplay, and that can really suck me in sometimes.
6 out of 10!
The indie game boom of the late 2000s and early 2010s still feels like a recent innovation in gaming to me. But as I get older, I realize that these games are getting old. It's at this point that the more resilient games are starting to show, and I think Super Meat Boy might be one of them. Super Meat Boy was one of the biggest hits of the new indie craze, and for good reason. It's got fun visuals, crude humor, an easy to understand plot, and above all else, really tight gameplay. Super Meat Boy is not for the faint of heart. This game will test your patience and then some, because the developers Team Meat knew they had a tight game and they pushed it as far as they could. You've got everything from falling blocks to lasers to monsters and of course a fuck ton of saw blades. But notice that even though this game is tough as nails, there's no leaps of faith and there's no random chance. Because of that, I still felt in control of every death, which pushed me to keep going. Nowadays, Super Meat Boy has become a pretty iconic title. It was part of the crew that paved the way for big indie games that push the boundaries of what games could be. It's certainly not a game for everyone. If you're prone to rage, you might want to skip this in order to keep your security deposit, but rest assured, if you're looking for a challenge, Super Meat Boy will be happy to deliver a beatdown.
8 out of 10!
I've been following Superhot since very early on. Originally, I found it online as a Unity game. There, it was only a 10-minute demo that showed off the cool mechanic they had made, and that was kind of it. But it was still good enough to get me hooked for more. I would replay that Unity demo over and over and over, until one day the full game came out on Steam. This version of Superhot is a little more involved than the demo was. It's got a ton of levels, new weapons, and an actual story. The core of it is still the same. Time only moves when you move, and that turns this would-be run-of-the-mill FPS into a crazy puzzle action game. Because you have more time to think, the game will throw a lot more things at you to test your awareness. Enemies and projectiles will be coming from all sides, and it keeps the game tense all the way up to the end. Superhot is a very abstract game. It's most obvious in its visuals. Enemies are red, interactable objects are black, and everything else is white. This also comes through in its story. Superhot's story can be about many things depending on how you look at it. From my point of view, it's a commentary on the games industry, but you can see just given my online background why I might take that approach. Regardless, it's a plot that wants you to think, and I really appreciate that. For those looking for some pure Superhot action, it can be a roadblock, and sometimes it's nice to just sit down and not have your game point fingers at you. Superhot is the only game with this gimmick right now, so if you want to play this game, you're going to have to sit through some of this, and I can see how that can be off-putting. The game can also get kind of monotonous at points. Longer sittings can make things blend together into a kind of mush. Everything looks the same, and that really hampered my enjoyment at points. You can always say that this is part of the point, but then it becomes a circular argument between the game's messaging and the player's enjoyment. I just wanted to note that it's there. Otherwise, I think Superhot is a pretty fun time. The gameplay is really tight, and even though the story can put people off, I think there's enough of a balance to recommend this to most people.
7 out of 10!
I thought Superhot Mind Control Delete was going to be a DLC for the original Superhot, but it turns out it was a separate game entirely. Not only that, but owners of the original game got Mind Control Delete for free. It was an interesting move from the developers to do such a thing. Personally, I was a little burnt out after playing the original, but thanks to this list, I had to hop into Mind Control Delete, and I'm glad I did. What I like about Mind Control Delete is how in your face it is. Right from the beginning, you are interfacing with the game as if it's a living, breathing thing. The game will talk directly to you, and your inputs are how you talk to it. This makes the whole experience feel a lot more personal than the first game. In the first Superhot, I felt more like a stand-in character for a satire, but in Mind Control Delete, that surrogate is completely gone, and it's just me and the game. This back and forth is so fascinating to me that I could talk about it for hours. After beating it, I had a conversation with my family about it and what it says about the psychology of games. Yeah, nerdy shit, but it goes to show how fascinating I found it. The gameplay of Superhot Mind Control Delete is vastly the same as the first game, the only difference being a few new power-ups. The structure of the game is very different, however. Mind Control Delete is not as linear in its progression. Eventually, given enough time, you will end up in the same spot, but how you get there is up to you, thanks to the branching mission trees, which kind of give me a dungeon crawler vibe. My only problem with this setup is the amount of repetition. There aren't that many different maps to speak of in this game, and you'll start seeing repeats very early on. I didn't mind it at first, but towards the end it got to be kind of obnoxious, even with the game changing some things. Superhot Mind Control Delete was still such a fascinating, mind-melding experience that even with the repetition, I came away really enjoying it. I generally appreciate a game that's self-aware, and this one is extremely that. It's nice to be reminded every now and then what video games can do to us. I think all media, and games especially, are more than just consumable products.
products. These are powerful things that can affect our thoughts and actions, and Mind Control Delete is happy to expose some of that psychology, all while remaining entertaining with its signature super hot gameplay. You don't have to take it too seriously, of course, and you probably shouldn't take it all at face value, but if you're an analytical person like myself, you will love this game.
8 out of 10!
I used to play a ton of Team Fortress 2. It was endless amounts of fun, but a lot has changed since then. My interest in TF2 dropped off a decent amount of time before they overhauled the matchmaking system, before casual and competitive and all that. My TF2 was hopping into random servers and trying out new weapons and all that. I tried hopping in a few times since those big changes, but I never found it as fun. It's not like the core of TF2 has changed very much, just the stuff surrounding it. You can still blast guys with rocket launchers and shotguns and wear silly hats. You can also still join tons of custom servers, which were something my friends and I did all the time. Joining custom servers is still a bit dangerous as it's not as moderated as the Valve servers are, but it can provide a refreshing bit of gameplay to the mix if you're tired of capture points and whatnot. It's no secret that the support for TF2 has been drying up for a while. The game doesn't get any significant content updates anymore, and the lack of supervision has allowed a ton of bots to come in and ruin the experience to an extent. It's a shame because TF2 deserves more love than that, and the players shouldn't have to fight so much for attention. Personally, I think the game is still fun even if it's lost a bit of its charm. The PvP is still pretty good even if it's not what it used to be, and man vs machine has always been a blast. TF2 has a lot going for it. It has so much to its name already, and even though it's still a blast, it is showing signs of dying off, I hate to say. But it's not dead yet, and until that happens, I will gladly call it a great game.
8 out of 10!
The Escapist is just not my kind of game. I'm willing to say that right off the bat. I thought I'd really like it. I was interested enough in its premise to purchase it, so I had some faith, but my experience as a first-time player was confusing and disheartening. I'll state again, the premise of this game is really cool. Finding a way to escape prison is a simple concept that allows for a ton of creative gameplay solutions, including lots of maps, stealth options, crafting, and more. For me though, I just had to accept that I wasn't very good at this game. My main issue is that I didn't get any sense of direction. I knew what the goal was, but I didn't feel any nudge from the game's systems to figure out any of the escape options. In the first map, I spent a lot of time just doing the day-to-day chores waiting for something to happen. Escapist is a puzzle game at heart, so I felt really bad about looking up the solutions, but I was lost. The hints didn't help. The crafting system felt convoluted and my inmates had already lost interest in me, so I did look it up and I was impressed by the amount of solutions there are to just the one level. The Escapist looks simple on the surface, but there's actually a lot going on. I think my main issue is that the game doesn't want to give me an entry point. It just dropped me in and said figure it out. For some people that might be really exciting. Hell, there's plenty of other games that hooked me in that exact way, but The Escapist just came in at the wrong time. I wasn't looking for a game like that, and so it was a struggle to give it the time of day. To be honest, it's still not a high priority game for me. There's plenty of other games out there that have what I'm looking for, and until something changes, The Escapist will probably continue to sit.
5 out of 10.
Tomb Raider felt like the video game equivalent to a fun action movie. I had a nice time from beginning to end, but I don't think I have much to say from a review standpoint. The main goal of this game was to bring back Lara Croft into the spotlight, and I think Tomb Raider did a decent job. You've got fun mechanics, a nice looking environment, and an okay story. My main detractor was definitely the story though. It felt like the plot to a typical action film. A group of explorers gets lost on an island and they need to fight their way out, uncovering mysteries along the way. In the end, they free the local people from tyranny and they all go home in bandages, but nonetheless happy. I'm surprised there wasn't an award ceremony at the end. Needless to say, I wasn't very interested in the plot. I lost interest about halfway in, but the moment-to-moment action of Tomb Raider's gameplay kept me engaged. You've got lots of cool set pieces and cinematic moments mixed in with some stealth action, shooting, and even some crafting and exploration. Don't get it twisted though, Tomb Raider is a really linear game. I think there were elements of an open-ended adventure tested out here, like the side tombs you can raid, but it feels like it's at odds with the movie-like approach to storytelling. But like I said, in spite of its flaws, Tomb Raider is a solid game. The mechanics all feel remarkably well done, from the combat to the puzzles to the exploration. Even the crafting system isn't that bad. It's a really digestible game if you're looking for a new play, and I don't think you'll regret your time spent on it. Just don't expect any masterful commentary or super innovative gameplay.
7 out of 10!
TowerFall Ascension ended up being a frustratingly good time. It's a pretty simple game. You're an archer placed in an arena and your goal is to survive a certain number of rounds to make it to the next stage. In single player, enemies come in a bunch of different shapes and sizes, and most of them will give you trouble. I'd recommend playing TowerFall with a friend. Not only does co-op make the campaign a little easier, but you'll find yourselves adjusting strategies after each defeat, communicating between rounds and then focusing up during the action. It was a cool thing to experience. You'll also get to play each other in versus mode, which I thought was really fun. The co-op single player can be fun, but it gets pretty monotonous at points with how much trial and error there is towards the end. With versus mode, that isn't a problem. You can enjoy the game's simple but effective mechanics without worrying about enemy AI or lasting a certain number of rounds to progress. Just hop in and start shooting. Whenever I played TowerFall Ascension, I would get to a point of frustration with the game, but every time I left, I wanted to come back. I think that's a testament to this game. Even though I can't exactly describe what it is, something was bringing me back until we beat it. It's got cool art, fun music, and above all, an effective gameplay loop. Shooting arrows, running around to pick them back up, all while avoiding enemies or the other player. It's tense, it feels good to pull off, and it's easy to understand. So while I did get pretty frustrated with TowerFall Ascension, and it's not something I'm dead set on returning to, it did keep me coming back and ultimately enjoying the experience up until the end.
6 out of 10!
I don't think I fully understood Transistor while I was playing it, but I was still having a good time. The story of Transistor made little sense to me up until the end. Things were finally starting to come together at that point, but I still had questions. But even though the plot was a bit abstract, I was having fun mostly through the action. The best way to describe it would be like a hybrid between turn-based and real-time action. At any point, you can pause the battle and lay down a bunch of moves, but this drains your meter, so you'll have to avoid enemy attacks for a moment until it refills. Alternatively, you can play this all out in real time, but those actions will still run down that meter, and you won't be able to dish out as much damage at one time. It's a really interesting system, and on top of all the abilities you gain throughout the journey, I really felt the back and forth of this mechanic. It wasn't so much about the battles themselves, but rather creating an effective kit that suits my playstyle. All while this is playing out, you're treated to some gorgeous visuals and sounds. At this point, Supergiant Games is known for their immersive visual and audio design. Along with their experimental approaches to mechanics and storytelling, this is what sets them apart. There's a great blend of sci-fi elements mixed in with some more classical art and architecture that makes Transistor's signature look, and I love how the music reflects this. It's not afraid to mix opposing sounds, which again makes a unique blend. All these elements come together to make a very unique game. Not just a unique one, but one that does the balancing act of doing something different and keeping people there to see it. Sometimes Transistor can be hard to understand. There are a few moments I had to really power through thanks to an unclear motive, but I'm glad I stuck it out to the end.
8 out of 10!
Do I really need to talk about Undertale? For those not in the know, I've already sung my praise at least a couple times, and that doesn't count how much I talk about it outside of the internet. This is an example of a game that sets out to do something and pretty much perfectly executes it. Not only that, but it did it in its own way, creating a wildly popular subculture in the process. Undertale is ultimately a game about video games. It's painfully self-aware, and that sort of meta experience can be really annoying to get through. A lot of games attempt this sort of narrative, but end up falling flat on their face because they are exactly what they critique. Undertale is a game about games, but it's also a story about morality, friendship, ignorance, talking dogs, and so much more. It's a game that can be enjoyed for any multitude of reasons. For the music, the lore, the funny skeleton man with the slip-ons, anything. But everyone already knows this game is good. The internet will never shut up about it. It's quirky and fun, and also heartbreaking and serious, and charming and contemplative. And yeah, of course it's a 10. I went into this game expecting to hate it. The fan base was really obnoxious, and as an outsider, I didn't understand the hype. Playing it turned me around almost right away. After Toriel, there was no going back. The game had me. I played neutral the first time, then pacifist, and finally a genocide run. All of those experiences I'll never forget, and I can't believe they were all from the same game. Most everything about this game excels, and that deserves a ton of credit to Toby Fox and to everyone else who worked on this game. It's already become an icon, and is already showing to be a classic game that will be remembered for a while to come.
Oh my god, it's a 10 out of 10!
I personally don't think Unturned is worth playing anymore. I thought it was fun years ago. I thought the simple graphics were kind of charming, the gameplay was more complex than that would lead you to believe, and overall I just liked the pure survival approach. There are plenty of games that do this sort of thing, but Unturned felt like it tuned down all the other fancy stuff so my kid brain can understand what was going on. Nowadays the game is really boring. Even early on sometimes it would be hard to find any action on a particular server, but now that player base has died down so much, any multiplayer excitement is a rarity. The last
last time I played, I brought some friends along and we wandered around the map aimlessly looking for stuff to do, collecting enough items to keep us alive, looking for any semblance of other players. At the end of it all, we found maybe one other squad whom we traded shots with and then left us alone. In the state that Unturned is in, I found it to be a really boring game. Without the pressure of running into another player, all the systems at play kinda lose their purpose. Zombies are really only a nuisance. They're meant to drain your resources, not be a main threat. So when that ends up being all you face, the game becomes really unsatisfying to play. The other solution might be to bring your own group of players to fight against, but the maps are so big that you would need a lot of people to make that feel organic. Unturned in a vacuum is fine, but the main draw to this game was the huge maps full of wandering players. Without those players, the game falls flat, and unfortunately those numbers are not what they used to be. The vitality of the game was hanging by a thread the last time I played, and to get the best experience you need to put in a lot more work than it's worth, so I just keep moving.
3 out of 10.
I really could not be bothered to write something on War Thunder. I played this game for maybe an hour and then put it down, never to play it again. But it's still sitting in my library and on my list, so per the rules I have to give it some time. The only thing I'll say is that I think the idea of War Thunder is cool. Players participate in almost all aspects of the battle, which makes an interesting simulation. For me, it seemed cool, and then I started playing and didn't find it very interesting. It just seemed a bit slower than I was looking for, so I went back to other games. Honestly, the only reason it's getting a review is because I never figured out how to remove games from your Steam profile. Oh, wait, I found it.
5 out of 10.
Yet Another Zombie Defense was a really cheap game my friends and I bought to try out for fun. In that context, I guess you can say it's a good game. There's a lot of cheap or free games in this vein that are broken or scams or both, but Yet Another Zombie Defense is neither. It's just bad instead. Playing the game was fun for maybe 30 minutes and then it was time to set it down. It's just the same wave after wave of zombies in a blank void with really annoying sound effects and music. Whenever I think of this game, I think of that void, how it's a perfect analogy for what this game offers. It starts off with nothing but you and some zombies, and then you get to place down some traps and go again. All this game does is feed you zombies until you die. Minimal effort. Everything else comes from the player. It's not very interesting or satisfying. It might be fun to laugh at for a few minutes, but eventually it just becomes a waste of time.
2 out of 10.